Today's episode is a special one. Joining me are three very special guests that I'm excited to have helping me tell all the chilling mysteries, from Crater Lake National Park all the way to some pretty hairy cryptid stories. Well, you won't want to miss this one. In 1662, a group of English settlers arrived in what is now East Haddam, Connecticut, looking to purchase land from the local Algonquin tribes. The settlers had been scouting various locations up and down the Connecticut River Valley, and they'd found this particular spot that seemed perfect. It had rich soil for farming, you had access to the river for transportation, and plenty of timber for building. And so when they approached the tribal leaders about buying this land, they were shocked when the natives immediately agreed to sell it for just 30 coats. They knew that something wasn't adding up here. They had been negotiating land purchases all throughout the region, and typically these deals involved very extensive bartering and much higher prices. But here were these natives practically giving away this prime piece of land for what would be equivalent to about $100 today. The settlers were of course suspicious, but they weren't about to question what seemed like an incredible deal. And so they quickly finalized the purchase and began setting up their new settlement. That is, until about 2 weeks after moving in when they heard it for the first time. The settlers were awakened in the middle of the night by what sounded like cannon fire coming from deep underground. The sounds were so powerful that houses shook, windows rattled, and people's beds actually moved across their bedroom floors. Even more terrifying was that these sounds weren't just coming from one spot. They seemed to be moving underground, almost like something massive was tunneling right beneath their feet. And when they confronted the natives about these strange sounds, the Algonquin tribe just nodded knowingly. And they explained that they called this area, hopefully I don't butcher this, but Matchit, which literally meant the place of bad noises. Now, according to their beliefs, these sounds weren't just some natural phenomenon. They were coming from something, or rather, someone. Now, they believed that these sounds were being made by their god Hobomok, a powerful and malevolent spirit who lived inside the hollow center of nearby Mount Tom. They said that this Hobomok took the form of a giant serpent who controlled darkness, disease, and bad weather. And these were Hobomok's voice, his way of communicating with the world above. The Algonquins explained to the settlers that these noises had been occurring for as long as anyone could remember. Their tribal shamans had, of course, dedicated their entire lives to interpreting these sounds, believing they carried messages and warnings from the spirit. And whenever the noises became intense, the tribe would just perform elaborate ceremonies, making sacrifices, and saying prayers to appease this underground spirit. But the settlers weren't exactly interested in just native spiritual beliefs. They were determined to make this land work, and so they began developing the area anyway. Now, over the next century, East Haddam transformed into a major industrial center, becoming known as the twine capital of America. They built over a dozen mills along the river, producing cotton yarn, cotton duck, and twine. But all the while, these mysterious sounds continued. And one of the most detailed accounts of these noises came from Reverend Stephen Hosmer, who lived in the area for over 20 years. In his journals, he described hearing hundreds of these sounds, explaining that they sounded exactly like small firearms. He noted that on some nights, he would hear 8 to 10 distinct sounds within just 5 minutes, and they always seemed to come from the north, and they were powerful enough to shake his entire home. However, the strangest part of it all is how he described the progression of the sounds. He explained that they would start with a deep, low rumble, almost like distant thunder. Then, there would be a series of sharp, explosive sounds, followed by what he described as rolling noise, like heavy objects being dragged underground. Then, there would be this strange, groaning sound that seemed to fade away into nothing. The sounds became such a normal part of everyday life in East Haddam that people began developing their own theories about what was causing them. Some claimed it was underground water just rushing through caverns. Others believed it was gas exploding in underground chambers, but in the 18th century, a mysterious figure arrived in town who claimed to have the real answer. This mysterious figure was a man who called himself Dr. Steele. I know, it sounds like a Marvel superhero, doesn't it? He showed up in East Haddam one day, claiming to be an alchemist who understood exactly what was causing these strange noises. And the sounds weren't coming from any spirit or underground water. They were being caused by something he called a carbuncle. At the time, he explained that deep beneath the town was an enormous glowing stone, this carbuncle that was somehow creating all these sounds. And to prove his theory, he would walk around town showing people these smaller glowing stones that he claimed were tiny pieces of the massive carbuncle below. Now, just a quick bit of information. In modern days, carbuncle is now used in medical terminology. And simply, a carbuncle now is in reference to a skin infection that causes a large lump to form underneath the skin. And at the time of this story that I'm telling you, the term carbuncle was actually loosely applied to red gemstones, often with mystical or magical properties attributed to them. And the townspeople were shocked, as you can imagine. But one day, he claimed he had figured out a way to remove this large carbuncle from underground. And he said he would perform this extraction, but warned that he could only remove part of it. And he informed everybody that he would leave a smaller carbuncle in its place, which would mean the noises would continue, but they would be much less intense. And so after making this declaration, Dr. Steele vanished, never to be seen again. And strangely enough, many residents swore that after his departure, the noises did seem to become less frequent and less powerful, just as he had predicted. The legend of the Moodus noises, as they came to be known, spread far beyond Connecticut. In fact, in 1928, famous horror writer H.P. Lovecraft was so intrigued by these sounds that he incorporated them into his story, The Dunwich Horror. In the story, Lovecraft describes supernatural sounds, including rattling, rolling, groaning, screeching, and hissing, all details taken directly from actual accounts of the Moodus noises. Now, in modern times, scientists believe they finally have an explanation for what's causing them. They attribute them to small earthquake swarms, typically measuring between magnitudes 1 and 2 on the Richter scale. Micro-earthquakes occur at very shallow depths and are caused by ancient rock stress dating back many, many years. The low-frequency waves created by these small quakes perfectly match the measured seismic activity in the area, and they could still be heard today, especially around Cave Hill, where they can be heard clearly. And while science may explain the mechanism behind these noises, there's still something strange about standing in East Haddam at night, hearing these weird sounds coming from deep underground and wondering if maybe, just maybe, the Algonquins were right about what was really down there.
David and his wife really enjoyed camping, and it's something that they have done ever since the day they met. This time, they decided to take a trip to the Outer Banks of North Carolina to try a new place. The weather had been unusually warm that year, and they wanted to take full advantage of it and head south. The interstate highways are sort of a way of bypassing everything. And once you get to the highway to the local roads, you just get more of a community feel. As they got off the main road, it was already pretty dark and late in the evening, and they headed south towards Pettigrew State Park. It was such a strange experience right off the bat, as the whole area just had this creepy kind of feeling. The town was super small, and as they passed by one house specifically, there were people standing out in their front yard just watching them. Cars lined up with their headlights on, and then in front of them, people standing there with their backs to the cars, standing there staring at you with dogs on chains barking, and even as they drove by, one dog even stopped to look as well. They all kind of had this, where are they going kind of look on their face. David and his wife could both feel them glaring. They were just staring at the truck and camper, like I said, as they drove by. Neither David or Lisa had a good feeling at all when that happened. Would you? Like, first, why in the world are they standing in the dark, staring at them? But then they just tried to chalk it up to, sure, they're just not used to outsiders? At this point, they were definitely the only ones on the road, and the town, well, it was dead silent. As they continued through the small town, the road became more dark, and the houses became fewer and farther between. Soon they arrived at the park, and the campsite was completely open, and there were really no trees around at all. David can remember thinking to himself, so this is it. What a letdown for both of them. The reality was they were smack dab in the middle of a swamp. Not the view or beautiful, serene nature lot they had been hoping for. So they back up the camper into the fourth open lot, and as they were doing so, they noticed headlights headed towards them. As the truck pulled up, it was a park ranger, and as the park ranger pulled over, he looked a bit worried, and he said, "Hi, guys. So, are you guys planning on spending the night here?" David and Elizabeth nodded and told him how exhausted they were from the long drive, and they just wanted to get a good night's sleep. The ranger looked away for a few seconds and said, "Okay, it's a nice park. I'm headed home, but I will be back in the morning." Lisa leaned over to her husband and said, "If he is leaving, then we should too. I just don't feel safe here." David decided to muster up all the energy he could and decided Lisa was right. "Let's just drive a little further," he said. "Better safe than sorry." As they drove away from Pettigrew and chatted a bit about their experience, they agreed both had made the right decision. Now they needed to find a decent place to stay the night, so there was no choice but to drive 2 hours to Roanoke, where they had a big, well-lit shopping center like Walmart, Target, or whatever. The back roads were not lit at all. They were extremely dark, and it was difficult to see anything, if everything, on the road. Suddenly, they felt a little bump and thought, "Crap, that sounds like we hit something." David really wanted to take a look, but he did not want to stop and investigate in that place. It just felt like this area was a little too remote for them to get out of the truck. Something was off. But his wife urged him to pull over and make sure it wasn't something that was just lying there injured. As he stopped the truck and opened the door, he stopped for a second. He thought about it and grabbed the .357 Magnum from their glove compartment. If anything was out there, he wanted to be able to protect himself. He walked along the driver's side of the vehicle to check the truck, the tires, the hitch, and the trailer. It was all good so far, but as he walked around to the back, there he is staring at a broken taillight, and all of a sudden, the hair on the back of his neck starts to stand straight up. And then all of the insect noises just stop. Because he's been in the woods a lot, He knows that usually means that something is coming. At this point, David is on high alert. He's looking for an animal and he starts to look around. He's scanning the woods. Then there it is. Something staring right back at him. He slowly turns to see if he can spot it because it shot off. He can't see anything. So he just stands still, gets quiet, and listens. Then he starts to hear scrabbling noises coming from his left. The animal is about 20 yards away. It was a dog-like, wolf-like, large animal over 4 feet tall on all 4 legs. It was huge. He'd never seen anything like it. Large, forward-facing ears like a German shepherd. There seemed to be tufts of hair sticking out from the ears, and the yellow glowing eyes. It wasn't eye shine. He didn't have his flashlight on it right at this moment. They were really glowing yellow. When he looked into this animal's eyes, he saw the look of a hunter, not the look of the dogs he's trained in the past. This look was that of a predator hunting. It was hunting him. As David watched him, the animal did something that was so alien, so strange that it haunts him to this day. It pushes off the rock that's standing in front of him with his front feet, and he hears 2 distinct popping noises. David then sees this thing settle in on 2 legs. David was in complete shock. This dog-like, wolf-like creature is standing on 2 legs. It's now taller than any dog or any animal he's ever come across or in contact with. David got a really good look at him, and at this point, he says this thing stood at least 7 feet tall. He was very muscular from the waist up, and there was dark fur hair like a mane around his shoulders. And his paws, well, they weren't paws. They were more like hands with huge claws sticking out of them. The end lower half was a bit skinnier, and David couldn't see the thing's feet, but it did look like there was a short tail. As it took a step forward, it made a low growling noise, and it made a point to show David his teeth. The moonlight gave off just enough glow so David could see a little shine glinting off that thing's mouth, as if it was also drooling on top of showing those shiny teeth. After the growl, all of a sudden David noticed noise to his left again, his far left. And when he turned and looked, there was another one. He was being surrounded. He now did not know how many of these things there were. He'd only looked at it for 2 to 3 seconds before turning back to see the first one. He noticed it had moved 10 yards in his direction that fast, without hesitation. He aimed and fired his .357. The bullet struck the animal in the shoulder, and it was crazy, but it did not react. The beast just looked at him like David had punched him in the shoulder, like, hey, buddy. This was the point that David knew there was no way of him damaging this animal unless he really, aimed and maybe got a headshot. But now he's got to worry about other ones. For sure, there's one to his far left going behind him. So he realizes the only thing is to get the hell out of Dodge. He started to make a run through it, through the gravel, sees his wife Lisa hanging out of the passenger side, screams, "Get in the truck, get in the truck," goes around to the other side, driver's side, jumps in, and he takes off. His wife Lisa screams to him in the car, "What is going on?" David says nothing. He just stared at his wife for a second, and as she looked at him, tears started to fall on her cheeks. She could tell her husband was in shock, so she just sat quietly as he peeled out and headed down through the deserted road. Lisa could see David's hands were trembling around the steering wheel, and her heart was going so fast that her t-shirt was moving. She was just praying they did not wreck their truck so they could get the hell out of where they were. She didn't know what was going on, what happened back there, and why he shot the gun. She just wanted out. It was about an hour or so until they started to approach civilization and could start to calm down. David decided that he was not going to tell his wife everything. He didn't want to tell her exactly what he had seen because he thought if he told her, that would scare her beyond anything she could ever think of. He finally just told her he saw a wolf and that it was the biggest one you could ever imagine. As David got himself more together, he decided to head into the local store and get a few things. He pulled into the parking lot and they went in, got some stuff, and when they came out, they noticed a man sitting in his truck with a menacing look on his face, staring right at David. David thought to himself, "What the heck is this?" And Lisa asked him, "Who is that?" He said, "I've never seen this guy before. I don't know what his problem could be with me." So they walked closer to their truck. When David felt a little more comfortable, Lisa could get in. He said, "Go get in the truck, close the door, take these. I'll be back." He went over and headed over to the man's truck and said, "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" The guy immediately started to apologize. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. You look exactly like a friend of mine. I just wanted to tease him to give him a little, guff." David immediately said, "No problem. Happens all the time. You did have a pretty scary look on your face. I'm glad it's not for me." After a few more minutes of small talk, David started to notice 2 rifles on a rack inside of his truck. "So, you ever do any hunting?" The guy's head went down. He didn't say anything. He looked back at David, and David said, "Do you ever do any hunting in the swamp?" His answer will haunt David forever. Immediately, the man in the truck says, "I thought I was the only one. Oh my God." The man proceeds to tell David of what he saw and the details of the wolf. The description was so similar to what David had just seen. The whole time the man was talking to David, and David was thinking, I'm not crazy. It wasn't just me. Somebody else saw that thing." To this day, David thinks about the mystery of the lost colony on Roanoke Island in the 16th century. Could this dogman, wolf-like creature be the cause of all the missing 115 people that had vanished without a trace? That could happen very easily. The legend of the werewolf lives on as people continue to explore the secrets of the dark forests and lift the veil to the strange and unknown.
Wow, Matt, that was pretty intense. Hey, Mike, remind me what you were going to tell us earlier.
I actually found a story from a national park in southern Oregon at a place called Crater Lake. I hope that kind of fits what you were looking for. Now, throughout this surprising and mysterious story, I want you to keep one fact in mind. To the indigenous Native Americans, Crater Lake was regarded as a very sinister place. Legend has it that they would never look upon the lake, especially stare at it for too long. And you're about to find out why. How you doing, everybody? My name is Mr. E-Files, and I just wanted to give a huge shout out to What Lurks Beneath. Him pulling off this collab took a lot of his time and resources, so if you could all do a favor for him actually helping the storytelling community, just make sure to hit that like button so, you know, all of his hard work, he definitely appreciates it and deserves it. Thank you. So nestled in the heart of Southern Oregon lies a natural wonder that captivates the senses and chills the soul. Crater Lake National Park. And it's called Crater Lake because if you look at the lake, kind of like my background right now, it's in the shape of a crater. It's actually a very beautiful spot. And to the indigenous Native American people there, this cobalt blue lake was always regarded as a sinister place. Legend warns against gazing upon its waters for too long, because you just might fall under its spell and be lured to your doom. Okay, so picture yourself standing 8,000 feet above sea level, peering into this mesmerizing depths of America's deepest freshwater body. I mean, this isn't just any lake, it is a liquid abyss, the aftermath of Mount Masama's ancient volcanic collapse. So just imagine this serene giant cradled by lush forests and rolling hills, looking like a mysterious cinder cone born from fiery chaos frozen in the time for eternity. And on a chilling January morning in 1975, Charles McCullough, a restless 19-year-old with an insatiable wanderlust, bid farewell to the familiar sights of his Virginia home. And with hitching rides with strangers, he embarked on a journey that would lead him to the misty landscapes of Oregon. His destination, of course, would be Crater Lake, a place shrouded in whispers and ancient secrets and untold mysteries. So with nothing but his camera equipment slung over his shoulder, Charles was driven by a fiery passion for capturing the hidden wonders of nature through his lens. And the dense forest that surrounded Crater Lake appealed to him greatly, like forbidden realms waiting to be revealed. So at this point, as he kinda parted way with his other friends in Oregon, a sense of apprehension just lingered in the air, despite his assurance that he would definitely return within 2 days. Well, as you could imagine, days passed and Charles did not return. Alarm bells rang and the National Park Service Rangers actually sprang into action, their urgency palpable in the tense air. And the unforgiving weather only intensified the already daunting task at hand, as these biting winds and relentless storms just kept sweeping through that rugged area. Charles's father rushed to Oregon, his heart obviously heavy with worry, and with his assistance, a monumental effort unfolded. I mean, you had a combination of ground teams and helicopters meticulously scouring every inch of this vast wilderness for any sign of McCullough. And the father poured his heart and soul into this arduous search, spending endless days tirelessly exploring every inch of that national park. And Cascade Rescue and Emergency Service teams launched daring missions across these treacherous terrains, navigating through these icy slopes on snowmobiles, and expertly skiing down these perilous inclines, and embarking on grueling hiking expeditions in their relentless pursuit of clues. Yet despite their unwavering determination and expertise, McCullough's whereabouts remain shrouded in total mystery, leaving all of those involved grasping at straws. I mean, imagine this. It was weeks of detailed grid searches that seemed to just stretch on endlessly. And hope was sadly dwindling at this point because no trace of Charles surfaced from the unforgiving landscape. And his father left no stone unturned in this frantic quest, you could say, for answers, reaching out to every possible avenue for assistance. I mean, even from the FBI to influential congressmen clinging onto a thread of hope during this agonizing time. Then, A whole 20 months later, on October 14th, 1976, things took a very bizarre turn. You see, hikers that were up there at that time just having fun happened to stumble upon a backpack and car keys just lying on the ground near Bybee Creek. So once they found these items, they took them to the park staff, who went to investigate the area and the items that they found. And what they discovered would only deepen the mystery surrounding Charles McCullers' disappearance. Okay, the location was almost 13 miles from the trailhead where McCuller had last been seen on the day that he vanished. And at the time of his disappearance, and I really want you guys to grasp this, there were 7.5 feet of snow on the ground. The snow was so thick and high that it seemed impossible that Charles could have traveled 13 miles on foot off of the trail in snow that was taller than him. So at this point, as the ranger searched the area where his car keys and backpack were found, they made a grim discovery: McCullers' partial remains. I mean, much of his body was just gone, likely due to the harsh environment and natural predators in that area. His jeans were found, though, unbuttoned, and his coat was missing. His shirt and boots were gone. I mean, was it possible that he had undressed as hypothermia set in? I mean, hypothermia often makes a person feel very hot when they're actually freezing cold. But if so, where did his coat go? And the boots? His expensive camera had disappeared too. At this point, the questions just kept multiplying. I mean, had he been robbed? But if so, seriously, how would a robber venture out in the snow taller than himself? And if McCuller had somehow miraculously managed to travel 13 miles in the snow, why would he have done that in the first place? And even stranger, how had he left absolutely no snow tracks to follow? I mean, right, there should have been a long trail of footprints for the searchers to follow straight to his location. But something else was actually off. The condition of his skeleton was oddly disturbing, and some of his bones from his feet were found in his socks. But his jeans were completely empty of bones except for the broken off ends of his shin bones, which were striking upwards. I mean, where had all of his other leg bones gone? So at this point, Charles Butch Farby, head of the Department of Interior and responsible for the management of the conservation on federal land, reported that the rest of his bones were gone too. John D. Finn, an offbeat Oregon magazine, described it as if he had melted away. And the search team also then stumbled upon the remains of his skull, cradled in a patch of grass. And along with his skull was his lower jawbone, partially obscured by the fallen leaves on the ground. But it was found over 10 feet away from the rest of the body. The scene defied logic and explanation. So officers from the Oregon State Crime Lab were flown into that area by helicopter to now conduct a more thorough search again. The area where McCuller was found was described as remote, mountainous, and rugged terrain area. So how did he get into such an inaccessible location? The park rangers theorized that Charles must have been trying to cross a frozen creek, as it would have been the easiest path to travel at that time, and that he had fallen in through the broken ice and then perished. But if that's the case, how did his skeleton end up sitting on a log in a remote and rugged area and not in the creek? I mean, nothing made any sense. Could McCuller have actually been abducted on the hiking trail or before he set out on his supposed 13-mile trek? Could be, and then from there his body was taken back to a remote area sometime later and then placed in this remote spot. I mean, how else could he have reached it when there had been snow taller than him when he set out? The Oregon Crime Lab analyzed samples of his hair and clothing at the scene and determined that Charles had died at that spot and that he had not died or been killed somewhere else. They believed that he died of exposure and that there were no indications of foul play. But how did McCuller's skeleton come to be sitting on a log? And what had snapped his shin bones off, along with his skull and jawbone laying 10 feet away. I'm telling you, this is an absolutely crazy place to visit. I'm serious. And if this wasn't, chilling enough, the tale of Charles, well, here's when things get really interesting with this other incident that happened in the 1940s that adds to Crater Lake's sinister reputation. So now imagine this. Mr. and Mrs. Cornelius stood at the lake's edge, just, out and admiring the view. And without warning, Mrs. Cornelius witnessed a surreal scene unfold right before her eyes. Her husband calmly just removed his wallet and his watch, placing them gently in her hand. And with a determined expression, he settled onto a snow-covered ground, then without warning, launched himself down a slick snowshoot towards the frozen lake below. And you could hear the sharp crack of his breaking leg that just pierced the serene soundings. But yet, he pressed on, undeterred, almost as if something had taken control of him. So despite his injury and literally being fine just a minute ago, he literally dragged himself to the lake's edge, his determination unwavering as he waded into the icy waters at Crater Lake, until they swallowed him whole in a haunting final act of self-destruction. It is suggested that Mr. Cornelius was gazing upon the beautiful Crater Lake, but this time he stared at it for a little too long, enacting this ancient curse of it being a sinister landmark. And when he did, something overcame him that even his strongest willpower could not ignore. I mean, these tales that are separated by decades share a common thread: the inexplicable pull and sinister nature of Crater Lake. I mean, is there truth to the Native American warnings? Does the lake possess a malevolent power that can overcome even the strongest of wills? For those who visit Crater Lake, the breathtaking beauty is undeniable. But as you stand on its edge, marveling at the pristine waters and rugged landscape, remember the stories of Charles McCullough and Mr. Cornelius. So take your photos and admire the view, but heed the ancient wisdom that we often do not. Do not gaze too long into the depths of Crater Lake, because in its waters, beauty and danger intertwine, and the land between wonder and terror blurs into the mist. As you leave, you might find yourself glancing back, drawn by this inexplicable urge to look once more. In that moment, ask yourself, is it merely the lake's beauty that calls to you, or something way more sinister? That was definitely one of my favorite stories that I was able to find and tell in quite some time, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, if you enjoy Native American places that are cursed, and this didn't satisfy your quench because you are forever thirsty, well, guess what? My friend Carol Ann has another one for you.
I absolutely have a Native American curse I can add to the mix. Yosemite National Park in California is crazy full of stories and legends. The park is huge, covering almost 748,000 acres. That's about 1.17 million square miles, or just over 3 million square kilometers of rugged wilderness in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Central California. The trouble seems to have started way back in the early 1800s when white men decided to settle in the area where the Native American Awanichi tribe had been living forever. They get along for a while, but it soon becomes apparent that the Awanichis don't understand the concept of private property and help themselves to several cattle belonging to the white ranchers. The white ranchers demand the Native Americans be relocated, and that goes about as well as you would expect. In the ensuing battle, known as the Mariposa Indian War, Chief Tenaya's son is killed, which prompts the chief to curse the land around them, saying, "You may kill me, Sir Captain, but you shall not live in peace. I will follow in your footsteps. I will not leave my home, but I will be with the spirits among the rocks, the waterfalls, in the rivers, and in the wind. Wheresoever you go, I will be with you. You will not see me, but you will fear the spirit of the old chief and grow cold." And to this day, not only are there weird happenings pretty much all over Yosemite Park, but specifically in Tenaya Canyon, now known in search and rescue circles as the Bermuda Triangle of Yosemite, with a death toll of 110 souls and counting. So many accidents and deaths have been reported in the canyon that the National Park Service has a pretty stark warning sign at the entrance to the 10-mile stretch of canyon that reads, "Warning, this is not a trail. Travel beyond this point is dangerous without climbing equipment. Return to Tioga Road." This place even came close to taking out experienced mountaineer John Muir, the father of national parks. He's climbing a pretty high rock when he falls, tumbling head over heels until he passes out. When he wakes up, he finds himself wedged into a clump of bushes at the very edge of a very steep slope. Had he not been stopped by the bushes, probably would have been a permanent end to his mountaineering career. Funny thing is, he has no idea why he even slipped in the first place. Now, I get it. It's easy to chalk that up to just an accident. But then there's the story of Ron Koch, a guy who has literally spent his entire life climbing the peaks of Yosemite. Ron is camping way up on the side of a rock face in Tenaya Canyon, trying to get some sleep, when he feels something pulling on his sleeping bag. He describes the nocturnal encounter on the SF Gate website as, "It was something that came around in a teasing kind of way or something. It wasn't anything too dramatic, no lights flashing around or flying by you, just acknowledge that there was something else there." But some people believe that Chief Tenaya's curse isn't just on Tenaya Canyon, but includes the rest of Yosemite National Park as well. And I gotta say, I think I agree. Just a short distance from the entrance to Tenaya Canyon is the Ahwahnee Hotel. One of the hotel's designers was Mary Curry Tressiter, who, after the hotel opened in 1927, lived the rest of her life in an apartment on the 6th floor until her death in 1970. Sightings of her ghost are reported by both staff and guests alike. Thankfully, Mary's ghost seems to be more on the fun side than the scary side, and is known for tucking people in when they go to bed, folding their clothes, and moving their stuff around their rooms. But Mary's not the only non-living being still living there. In 1962, then President John F. Kennedy had a short stay at the hotel while visiting the area. Due to pretty severe back pain, he requests a rocking chair be brought to his room on the 3rd floor, which of course the staff quickly brings. Kennedy leaves the hotel and is assassinated just over a year later. After that, guests started reporting an ethereal rocking chair showing up in rooms throughout the 3rd floor, but especially in the room Kennedy stayed in, rocking all on its own, sometimes with him still in it. But don't be fooled into thinking that the ghosts of the Yosemite Valley only exist indoors. One of the most famous haunted spots in the area is Grouse Lake, less than 12 miles nearly due south of Tenaya Canyon. The first official report of an otherworldly nature was recorded in 1857 by a guy named Galen Clark, who would later become Yosemite's very first park ranger in 1867. Galen is out on a hike to the small lake. Once he gets there, he starts strolling along the lakeshore and hears this unnatural wailing sound, which he describes as something like the sound of a lost puppy that seems like it's coming from the water itself. Soon after, he visits some of the local natives and tells them what he heard and asks them, "Do you guys know what kind of animal makes that noise? Or did somebody around here lose a puppy?" The natives tell him that was not a puppy. That was the spirit of a native boy who had drowned in the lake 3 years earlier, who didn't like strangers tromping around his lake and would wail at them anytime somebody passed by. And if anyone dared go in the lake, the boy would grab their legs and drag them under. Galen leaves that meeting thinking, whatever, they must be just messing with me. Must have been just some kind of bird I've never heard making the noise. But But over time, he became convinced that the Native Americans who told him the story were not just pulling his leg. They believed every word they said. Another seemingly haunted location is Bridal Veil Fall, a 617-foot drop off a sheer granite cliff. Winds at the top are said to be unpredictable, so if you get too close to the edge, a surprise gust of wind could blow you over the edge. And according to the Awanichi people, that's exactly what the evil spirit Pohono likes to do. Either by using hypnotic rainbows in the mist, calling out to you, or even appearing in the mist herself, she will draw you close enough to the edge that a large wind gust will finish the job. Campers in the area have even reported hearing strange noises coming from the area of the falls at night. There are a number of people who have fallen to their deaths over the edge of Bridal Veil Fall. But at least today, there are railings at the top to keep Pohono on her best behavior. And let's not forget the staggering number of missing 411 cases that have been reported in the park. In David Paulides' book, Missing 411, Western United States and Canada, he lists 32 disappearances that fit his list of strangeness factors occurring in the park between 1923 and 2009. Then I found a list of an additional 8 that seemed to be pretty dang strange occurring between 1972 and 2021. 2 of them were only 3 months apart. One of the most intriguing of these is the case of Sandra Hughes. Her case takes place just outside of Yosemite National Park, but only by about 8 miles. And this case, so freaky that we're going to include it in the area's overall weirdness. Sandra is a 54-year-old blue-haired accountant with a passion for outdoor survival who, in the quarantine summer of 2020, decided to go on a solo hike just south of Yosemite in the Sierra National Forest. She tells her family that she's leaving on June 26th for a place called the Johnson Meadows. On July 2nd, some hikers are walking through the Johnson Meadows and see some campsite is torn apart with food and papers everywhere. Looks a little suspicious. They alert the Madera County Sheriff's Office, who come out, look through the campsite, finding an ID for Sandra Hughes. They call Sandra's family, who say that she is a neat freak. There's no way she would ever leave her campsite that way. On July 5th, a search is launched, but no sign of Sandra is found. However, they did find her car at the bottom of a ditch. Judging by the front end damage, searchers pieced together that Sandra had run into a tree, causing the car to roll into the ditch. The car looked just like her campsite, with everything that had been inside strewn all over the ground around the car. They decide to leave the car where it is in case she returns, and leave a bright red note on the car to let Sandra know that her family is worried about her. On July 6th, her sleeping bag is found 2.5 miles from her car on the Yosemite Park boundaries. The Sheriff's Department posts Sandra's picture on their Facebook site, hoping somebody has seen her and her distinctive blue hair. Nothing. For weeks, rescue teams and volunteers searched the Sierra National Forest and Yosemite Park areas with helicopters and search dogs. And posters with her picture are put up everywhere in the hopes that someone has seen her. And it didn't take long. One hiker called police to let them know that he had seen Sandra over the 4th of July weekend, wearing a black shirt and jeans, and she had a bruise on her face. The hiker asked her if she needed help, but she just kept walking, completely ignoring him. But he didn't know that people were actually looking for her until he saw her missing poster later. About a month after that, on August 9th, a couple of hunters ran into a woman in the forest matching Sandra's description, but wearing a flowered t-shirt and overalls, just standing there staring into space. They tried to talk with her, but she just kept staring into space, not even acknowledging their presence. So they left. Police are confused by the change of clothing since she is not carrying anything and hasn't been back to her camp or her car. From there, the case goes cold for a year until one day in July of 2021 when the Gorba family is out to visit Shut-Eye Peak. Just as they're about to stop for a picnic, 3-year-old Caden points out the window of their car and tells his parents that there's a lady over in the meadow in a black shirt, jeans, and blue hair. She needs our help, but she's dead, and she's lying face down with her legs up, and she can't talk to me, but she's over there. We need to go help her. The dad, Jake, immediately gets out of the car and starts searching where Caden says the woman is, but Jake doesn't see anything. Totally freaked out, family decides to cancel the rest of the trip and go home, where the mom, Victoria, posts the whole creepy encounter on Facebook. The Madera County Sheriff's Office sees the post and asks the family to take them to the spot where Caden saw the woman. They don't see anything either. Unfortunately, that is the last anyone has ever seen of Sandra Hughes, spectral or otherwise, and her case is still open to this day. Now I know there are more Sandra Hughes level creepy specter stories out there. Anyone got a good one to share?
As a matter of fact, I do. And it deals with more than just apparitions. In fact, it seems as if the entire place is cursed. On a cold autumn morning in 1778, you had two English colonists named Jonathan Randall and Obadiah Higginbotham. What a name. And they stood at the edge of their property in Cranston, Rhode Island, watching British ships appear on the horizon. The men had heard rumors for weeks that the British were planning to attack coastal settlements, and now those rumors were becoming reality. Jonathan and Obadiah had spent the previous night gathering what belongings they would carry, knowing they would have to abandon most of what they owned. So that morning, they loaded 2 wagons with tools, supplies, and whatever furniture would fit. Their wives and children sat huddled in blankets on top of their possessions as the men hitched up their horses. The two families made their way inland, heading northwest through dense New England forest, and they traveled for several days until they reached the town of Pomfret, Connecticut. The town was far enough from the coast that British raids weren't a concern, close enough to trading routes that business would still be possible. Obadiah was a skilled craftsman who specialized in making linen wheels for spinning flax. Back in Rhode Island, he and Jonathan had run a successful business selling these wheels to local farms and textile mills. So when they arrived, the two men immediately began looking for a suitable location to restart their operation. They found an unclaimed parcel of land about 3 miles outside of town. The spot had everything they needed: a fast-moving stream for water power, plenty of timber, and good soil for farming. The two families set up camp and began the hard work of building a settlement. Jonathan and Obadiah named their new village Baraw. The name was meant to represent their hope that this place would provide sustenance and community for their families. And within months, they had constructed several wooden homes, a water wheel-powered textile mill, and separate quarters for the slaves they had brought with them from Rhode Island. The families cleared fields for farming and set up the linen wheel operation. They established the Higginbotham Linen Wheels Company, which quickly became known throughout the region for the quality of their spinning wheels. Other settlers began moving to the area, drawn by the promise of work at the mill and the fertile farming land. The village grew steadily over the next several years, and a small cemetery was established on a hill overlooking the settlement. The sound of the water wheel turning and the sight of smoke rising from chimneys became regular features of daily life here. The slaves who worked in the textile mill and tended the fields were the first to notice that something wasn't quite right about the area. Late one evening in the summer of 1780, a slave named Thomas was finishing up his work at the mill, and he was alone, organizing the day's production of linen wheels, when he looked up and saw what appeared to be a small figure, about the size of a child, darting between the spinning wheels. Now at first, he thought it must be one of the village children playing after dark, but when he walked over to investigate, there was no one there. Now the next morning, he mentioned what he'd seen to Sarah, who was another slave who worked in the fields. Now Sarah told him that she too had seen strange things, like shadows moving through the corn when no one else was around, and more reports began coming from the slave quarters. Many claimed to see these small, gremlin-like creatures scurrying around the village at night. Others reported hearing the distinct sound of a baby crying near the cemetery, even though there were no infants living in the Baraw at the time. The founding families didn't pay much attention to these stories. I mean, they were too focused on keeping the mill running and maintaining their growing business. But as the years passed, the success began to fade. After the deaths of Jonathan and Obadiah, their children struggled to maintain the linen wheel operation. The mill's equipment started breaking down more frequently, and fewer resources were available for repairs. The village entered a gradual decline. The water wheel began to rust, the fields slowly returned to the forest, and one by one, families started moving away. By the time the Civil War ended, this whole town was completely abandoned. What was once a successful operation now stood silent, with only the crumbling foundations and overgrown paths remaining as evidence of its existence. Activity here didn't stop because it was empty, if you know what I mean. If anything, it seemed to increase. Travelers passing through the area reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the ruins. Even local farmers told stories of hearing phantom wagon wheels creaking along the old village roads, and the sound of the mill's water wheel turning, even though it had long since fallen apart. The most commonly reported apparition was that of a bearded man walking near the old cemetery. Others claimed to see the spirit of a small child playing among the weathered gravestones. Additionally, there were strange orbs of light that were often spotted floating through the cemetery at night. Later on, in more modern times, unexplained streaks of light would appear in photographs. The sounds were perhaps the most unsettling part. People heard disembodied voices engaged in conversation, though they could never make out the words. There was laughter, crying, and sometimes screaming coming from the empty ruins. The sounds of farm animals, horses, cows, and chickens could be heard where no animals had lived for decades. In 1927, Harvard lecturer Odell Shepard decided to document the site after hearing numerous accounts of the strange happenings at Baraw. He spent several days mapping out the ruins and recording the layout of the abandoned village. During his investigation, he noted how the atmosphere of the place felt heavy and oppressive, even in broad daylight. Despite his investigations, he didn't find anything substantial. Fast forward to August of 1971, where the most detailed investigation of this village took place. A researcher named Paul Eno and his team arrived at the site, ready to get to the bottom of this. Upon their arrival, they noticed something odd. There were no animals or birds. It was a place that was totally silent. Figuring they didn't want to be there any longer than absolutely necessary, I can't blame them, they quickly got to work. They took measurements and photographs of the remaining foundations, and at some point during their investigations, one of the team members suddenly stopped and listened. He told the others he could hear what sounded like children laughing right near the brook. When the team went to investigate, they found no one there, but they all heard the sound of a dog barking and cows mooing coming from the empty fields. It was very strange. There just seemed to be a lot of strange energy around this place. At one point, one team member became frozen in place. He couldn't move his legs for several minutes, no matter how hard he tried. At this point, the team was freaked out. They had simply had enough for now and abandoned the investigation for the time being. 2 months later, in October, the same team decided to try for a round 2. But this time, they all experienced an overwhelming sense of depression that seemed to come from nowhere. It was so intense that several team members had to leave the site early. Those who stayed reported feeling like they were being watched from the woodline, and this ominous presence. The second investigation was also cut short. Before it ended, the team set up recording equipment near where the old mill once stood. They were trying to capture the sound of the phantom water wheel that so many others had reported hearing. And instead of mill sounds, they recorded what seemed to be a formal dinner party. Like the clinking of glasses, multiple voices engaged in conversation, and scraping of chairs. Local historians discovered that the Randall and Higginbotham families had hosted elaborate harvest dinners every autumn in the village's early days. These gatherings would bring together everyone in the settlement except for the slaves, who were made to serve the meals but never participate in the festivities. The team also noted that the temperature around the former slave quarters would drop dramatically without explanation. Their equipment recorded temperature variations of up to 30 degrees in these spots, even on warm days. And the cold spots would just disappear without any warning, often accompanied by the sound of people whispering in languages the team couldn't identify. In fact, one of the most detailed accounts came from a member of Eno's team who had stayed behind one evening to pack up equipment, and he described hearing what sounded like a complete day in the life of the village, starting with roosters crowing at dawn, progressing the sounds of the mill working and people going about their daily tasks, and ending with the quiet of nightfall. All of these noises occurring within the span of about 15 minutes. Since then, more and more paranormal and ghost hunters began trying to visit this place, but no one has ever captured or found anything of significance. In recent years, someone now owns this land and the property has become strictly private. The current owners posted no trespassing signs and actively discouraged visitors. It is now completely inaccessible to the public. The current owners of the property choose to remain anonymous, but even they have their own experiences. Even though they don't allow visitors, they've described hearing the same sounds that everybody else has. Children, women singing while working in their garden, among other strange experiences. Many believe that the land is cursed by displaced Nipmuc people who originally inhabited the area. Others suggest the site sits on some sort of portal to a parallel dimension, pointing to the strange time slip phenomena reported by visitors who claim to hear and see things from different periods in the village's history. The most commonly accepted theory is that this place is experiencing what paranormal researchers call a residual haunting, where past events and emotions have somehow been recorded into the environment itself, playing back like a recording. But to this day, no one has really been able to fully explain what makes this small patch of Connecticut forest so strange. However, I can't help but wonder what really happened in this place that made it unable to rest in peace. For now, it remains a mystery. Now, Mike, the question here is, do you got an apparition story of some kind?
I got you, Josh, because I found a story that might be of an apparition, but one that's definitely not cursed. One that actually may be the opposite of that. Anyway, that's for all of you to decide. You see, the winding mountain passes of California, Sierra Nevada hold endless beauty, but also relics of the lawless days when highwaymen stalked remote roads. But our story starts in June 1994. With a young mother named Christine Skubish when she set out on those lonely highways seeking a fresh start with her toddler son, Nick. But along the way, they vanished without a trace into the rugged wilderness, where things that will challenge your imagination happened. Okay, so Christine had dreams of reuniting with Nick's father and starting a new chapter in her life. So she packed her belongings into her old Hyundai and departed west from Sacramento. In the back, Nick's car seat held the chatty 3-year-old, always giggling and babbling excitedly. Christine felt hopeful about their journey ahead. And after stopping to visit a couple friends, Christine pointed the car towards the setting sun. And Nick soon dozed off as the Hyundai climbed steadily into the mountains. And this is where the road grew empty. Just the occasional passing truck or lone vehicle. And as night fell, for all of us who know who's ever driven more than 8 hours at a time, you start to get to that point where you almost got to slap yourself to wake up. Well, Christine fought that drowsiness of driving so long and in the dark, relying just on coffee and determination to reach their destination. Nick remained asleep, blissfully unaware of growing unease that his mother felt. And as the clock struck just past midnight, Christine stopped at a remote gas station to refuel her car. The fluorescent lighting and the attendant offered her little comfort. So then she got back in the car and then back on the road. And Christine, kind of shook herself awake, knowing that she couldn't stop again. Carson City, where she was heading, was still hours away. The car's headlights cut a feeble swath through the vast blackness ahead, along with these tall silhouettes of pine trees crowding the road's edge. Christine just strained into the void, dreading the possibility of deer or other wildlife darting out into her path. And up ahead, right up ahead, the road curved sharply, and Christine had to very much pay attention. And it was at this moment that Christine braked, entering the turn. But she actually started braking just a little bit too late. And from there, she felt the tires start to lose traction. The Hyundai then broke from the pavement, hurtling itself into the forest abyss beside the highway. Inside the plunging vehicle, Christine heard Nick's terrified wails before impact slammed her body forward. And then in an instant, their world became silent and still. And when Christine Skubish's mother did not receive the anticipated call from her daughter confirming their safe arrival at their destination, she grew quite anxious and eventually ended up contacting the authorities. Now, this story is amazing for two reasons, so hear me out. Okay, so a search for Christine and her 3-year-old son Nick ensued, but yielded no immediate clues. It was as if they had literally vanished into thin air. But meanwhile, 45 miles away in Sacramento, Deborah Hoyt woke up in the middle of the night with this disturbing dream. The dream just gave her an overwhelming sense of urgency, compelling her to drive along Highway 50 immediately. So she prodded at her husband saying, "Hey, we got to get on the road." He's like, "No, go back to sleep." But she insisted and insisted. She kept telling him, "It feels like right now there is something literally pulling me to that mountain." So her husband finally said, "Okay." And even though the midnight drive, in the remote mountains filled her with dread, Deborah couldn't ignore this insistent summoning. And as they neared a sharp bend called Bullion Bend, she suddenly shouted for her husband to stop the car. And there, illuminated by the headlights, lay a figure of a naked woman in the road. Initially thinking that it might be some sort of a mannequin or maybe a prank, the couple were hesitant to get out, thinking also that it could have been a setup for, other people to come and rob them. So as they're in shock, the couple just kept driving, and they drove to a nearby town to alert the police. And at 3 a.m., the bewitching hour, or the hour when things go on that we just don't quite understand, the El Dorado Sheriff's Department received their frantic call. From there, officers arrived swiftly but found no evidence of the body of Deborah that was described. With nothing but an empty road before them, authorities, kind of dismissed her story as a product of her overactive imagination. However, though, one of the deputies, Deputy Rich Strasser, couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was being overlooked. So as dawn broke, he decided to double back and revisit Bullion Bend. And he got out and started walking along the roadside, and he almost missed it. A tiny sneaker laying right on the pavement, peering over the steep embankment where it laid. And as he looked down, Strasser spotted a crumpled Hyundai far below in the ravine. So he immediately, scaled down the embankment, and Strasser discovered Christine, lifeless and still restrained in her driver's seat. In the back seat lay 3-year-old Nick, naked with his clothes neatly folded right next to him. Strasser believed that the boy was dead, but when he called out to him, Nick replied with a faint whimper. And miraculously, even though the car crash had killed Christine instantly, Nick had survived 5 days trapped beside her body without food or water. Even Deputy Strasser said until, he was right on top of the boy searching for vital signs, he believed him to be dead. And that's when Nick's faint sigh proved otherwise. Doctors later confirmed that Nick should not have survived this ordeal, calling it inexplainable. And this bizarre circumstance left many puzzled. I mean, for one, why had Deborah, a stranger on all accounts, envisioned the crash scene in such vivid detail, even claiming to see Christine's body? How had Nick also endured all those days alone? Well, we will get some answers, because as the little boy recovered in the hospital, thank God, he told his grandmother that he had left the car, climbing up the steep hill to the side. And his grandmother, Karen Nichols Daniels, was just absolutely shocked by this tale. He said there was a tree that was lying on his mommy, and he said he couldn't open up the door. But then, Nick described also seeing this bright ball of light like an orb that was floating right above him, with a silhouette of a woman's figure inside it. And he said that the orb was leading him up and down the steep hill. And as deputies, focused their reports on the probable cause of the accident, driver fatigue, the impact was enough to toss Nick's shoe onto the side of the highway, investigators noted. I mean, their car had plummeted 40 feet down a steep embankment. Yet the details of Deborah's vision and Nick's survival were hard to dismiss. But to add another layer, Nick's grandmother, which would have been Christine's mother, had her own story too. She explained that in the days her daughter was missing, she had been having these recurring dreams in which her daughter was calling out to her from a road. I mean, this story is true, and it just keeps getting even more and more unbelievable. The doctors agreed that if he had not been found when he was, Nick would have quickly deteriorated and died. His survival seemed like a miracle in all accounts, and locals actually spoke of ghosts and premonitions tied to the mountains themselves, bleak history of outlaws, hardship, and death. Christine and Nick's mysterious disappearance echoed similar accounts of travelers that were lost in the Sierra Nevada, where reality and legend often intertwine. In the aftermath, the story of Christine and Nick's tragic yet miraculous ordeal became a haunting tale. It seemed that in those lonely, treacherous reaches of the mountain, the lost sometimes reach out across the void, compelling the living to find them against all odds. I mean, Deputy Strasser himself said, "I think something special happened here. It's almost like a miracle. It's a whole series of events that I can't explain. I just don't have the answers." So we have a car accident in the Sierra Nevada where a mother and son are driving, and the mother is extremely tired, so she accidentally goes off a curve and flies 40 feet down into a ravine, killing her instantly. Yet the 3-year-old in the back seat somehow neatly folded his clothes while naked, trapped but got out, and went up and down a mountain basically for 5 days with no food or no water, following this orb that looked like a glowing light that had a woman figure in it. And then we have the unbelievable vision of Deborah, almost as if Christine, when she died, reached out to Deborah for some reason to track down where she was killed so they could find her child, Nick. I mean, if you don't believe in miracles, along with Deputy Strasser and his gut feeling to go back for a second time to look, if you add all of these things up, this story is truly, truly a miracle. And I hope you enjoyed it. There you go. I told you, if you want a premonition and an apparition in a story together, well, there it is. Matt, I know you know many stories about things that are like this or similar. Tell me a very interesting one that you know off the top of your head. Go.
I think I got one for you here. I'm going to tell the story about a well-known man named Tom Messic. Those of you who are familiar with the Missing 411, The Hunted, know this story. I'm going to talk about it right now. Imagine venturing into the woods on a routine hunting trip, only to vanish without a trace. This is the unsettling reality of the Tom Messic case, a story that still baffles investigators, hunters, and the paranormal community. Tom Messic, an 82-year-old seasoned hunter and Army veteran who disappeared on November 15, 2015, during a hunting trip near Brant Lake, New York. This was a situation where he went with his son, his best friend, and some other hunters to Brant Lake. What makes Tom's case especially chilling is not only his disappearance, but the strange, unexplained phenomena that occurred that fateful day. Tom Messic and his hunting group, as I said, made up of family and friends, were well acquainted with the wilderness. They set up near Lily Pond with a clear plan. Some would walk through the woods to drive deer towards the others who waited in designated spots. Tom's job was to stay put, waiting for deer to be driven his way. But after the agreed upon time, when the hunters regrouped, Tom was nowhere to be found. What occurred next was a nightmare for his son, his wife, his family, and friends. They started shooting a gun in the air, and if you're a hunter, I'm not, but I do know that if people are missing or a person is missing, you fire shots in the air to try and get their attention or get them to come back or follow them or fire another shot so that they know where it's coming from. It didn't happen. For days, search and rescue teams scoured the area. The amount of people that were brought was stunning. In fact, people asked in the missing 411, who is this guy? Is he, related to a state senator, or what's going on here? They brought so many people. What they did is they took everybody searching. They set them at specific areas, and they systematically went through all of the woods surrounding this pond. But they found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, no gun, no nothing. No clues at all. Tom Messic had simply vanished. Messic's best friend, who was hunting nearby, reported hearing something strange, very strange. He described it as something that you should never hear in the woods. He said he'd never heard it in his life. He described it as a loud, metallic snap, like a giant steel trap slamming shut. And if you can see my arms right now, I have giant goosebumps on them because that's horrifying. Was this a booby trap set up by some insane person? Was he underground? Did he fall through and a door shut after him? Was he taken by some cryptid like a Bigfoot or a dogman? Let's be honest, did aliens take him? Nobody knows what's happened to him. His best friend says it was unlike anything I've ever heard in the woods. Not an animal, not wind. This sound didn't belong there. This metallic sound, heard only by Messic's friend, doesn't match anything typically heard in a forest environment. It wasn't a branch breaking, a gunshot, or a mechanical noise from nearby towns. This sound, whatever it was, defied explanation. Since Messic's disappearance, theories have run wild. Could it have been a tragic accident where his body was simply overlooked? No, not with the systematic way that they looked through those woods in northeast New York. They covered literally every inch of that place. Was there something more? That's what I think. Some people have speculated about a strange phenomena, UFO sightings, portals, or even, like I said earlier, a Bigfoot connection. You know what's going on in the woods and the parks, national parks of the United States and other countries. People are disappearing at an incredible rate, which has brought David Paulides, an ex-police officer, into the fold. What he's been doing in his books, Missing 411, has been absolutely incredible. He talks about how much people disappear in our woods and our national parks and all over the world just without a trace. But what he does differently is he speaks of strange events, things that are outside of the norm. People disappearing without a trace. Searchers covering a specific area, coming back and finding said person unfortunately dead, without clothes on, their clothes folded neatly, shoes put there nicely. Obviously, they didn't do that. Other types of events like children disappearing and being found, sometimes alive or never again, but being found miles away in a very short time frame. where there's no possible way that they could cover those distances, especially a child. Another child found hundreds of feet up a sheer cliff on a little jutting sticking out. Stories of children talking about strange bear men and other types of what we would call cryptids and their explanations, talking about I was protected by the bear man or whatever else, as other types of animals were around me all night. They never got to me, though. David Paulides, the investigator behind Missing 411 series, highlights how Messic's case fits the disturbing pattern of disappearances in rural, isolated areas, often without any logical explanation. To this day, no trace of Tom Messic has unfortunately ever been found. The questions linger. What was the metallic sound? That's my number one question. When you watch the Missing 411 and you see Sid Sharp talking about it, he's almost scared, very disturbed when he's talking to David Paulides about it. He doesn't want to really go into it. He's very short. David tries to pull as much as he can out of him, but he only gets a tiny bit, unfortunately. But what he does give blows your mind. I get this idea in my head. Again, I'm going to touch on this. Was it some type of intricate booby trap set in the ground, covered with leaf litter and sticks and things? And because Tom Messic only had one eye and couldn't hear that well as well, according to his son, did he step on it? Did he go through it? Did the trap snap shut? We have to imagine the worst. Did it have anything to do with Tom's disappearance, that noise? It had to. How could an experienced hunter, years hunting, knowing these woods, how could he vanish in such a short time without leaving a single clue? Nothing. Not a wrapper. His wife talked about he had a candy bar, always had them on him. They found absolutely nothing. Tom Messic's case remains unsolved, unfortunately. Could there be forces out there that we can't explain? Perhaps the answer disappeared along with Tom. I know that there are things out there that most people will never know exist, and I'm glad you won't. It's mind-numbing to know about the types of things that are out there. And, you know, people like me are either made fun of, mocked, or lauded because of the ability to come out and tell the truth. The truth of the matter is that there are things that are unexplainable. We have absolutely no idea how many things there are out there that are paranormal, supernatural, cryptids, aliens, UFO, whatever. You can pick them all. It's up to you. They do exist. I want to say one more thing. David Paulides talks at the beginning of The Hunted about how the FBI does not get involved in missing persons cases, but they were there. When they found out what occurred and what went along with it, 2 FBI agents came along and made their presence known. They did not interrupt any of the investigations, but they were there. Why? What was so incredible about Tom Messic's disappearance that garnered the attention of the FBI? I think that needs to be looked at much deeper and more seriously. It's obvious something incredible and abnormal was going on there. There's a lot of it going on. I really want you guys out there who go into the woods, who hunt, who are alone, please be careful. A lot of people are disappearing, and Tom is just one of many. Another thing that David Paulides discusses is when he goes and speaks to park rangers about people that have disappeared. Park rangers officially say, I don't believe that they don't. They don't keep track of people that disappear. I find that hard to believe. I know they do, and so do you. Think about the amount of people that have disappeared with strange circumstances, unexplainable. Take, for instance, a child that was stolen from his family in the park, and other people said they saw a upright walking bear with a child over its shoulder running through the woods. When I watched the Missing 411 hunted, I was heartbroken at the very beginning of the video. It opens with Tom Messic's wife, Beverly, in her house and shows their dog staring out the window. And she says that the dog just stares out the window, waiting for him to come home all day, every day. I feel horrible for that dog with Beverly, and more so, of course, for Tom Messic's family. I'm thinking about some other stories that are out there that are incredible and strange. I do remember one. Hey, Carol Ann, don't you have a crazy, insane, mysterious story that you want to tell us? I know I want to hear it.
I sure did. But unlike Tom Messic, Nathan Campbell was looking for something a little bigger than a deer. But before I can tell you his story, I have to tell you another story. Story of a guy named Doug Muchler. Douglas A. Muchler is a retired U.S. Army counterintelligence warrant officer who was stationed at Fort Richardson just outside of Anchorage. When he first arrived in September of 1989, he was looking at area maps and was puzzled by a big section right in the middle of Alaska that was all white, with a note saying that the area hadn't yet been surveyed. What do you mean it hasn't been surveyed yet? But he just blew it off. Coming from military intelligence, he is pretty familiar with need to know, and apparently they didn't need to know. But then, the Chinese did something interesting. They set off a nuclear bomb. On May 21st, 1992, China set off a nuclear bomb that sent vibrations through the Earth as far as 4,000 miles away into Alaska. Now, it takes a little while to digest the data that comes in from our seismic monitoring network for an event like that. But roughly 6 months later, in November of 1992, our friend Doug is in the cafeteria of Fort Richardson with 39 other guys from his unit when a news report from Channel 13 gets his attention. The news report states that the data collected from the shockwaves from China's nuclear test in May shows an underground anomaly shaped like a pyramid right there in Alaska. Huge news, right? Doug, connecting the location given for the pyramid to the whited out area on the maps he'd seen years earlier, thought so, and eagerly awaited follow-up news stories. But none came. After a day of radio silence, he took a trip to the TV station that aired the segment to see if he could get a copy. The station manager said, "I don't know what you're talking about." As Doug's leaving, he's pulled aside by a station employee who said, "Yeah, we aired it. But right after, 2 guys came to the station and took all the tapes." Well, that's a dead end. But Doug never forgot about that story. Years later, Doug found himself in a classified archive in Fort Meade, Maryland. So he thought he would take a look at some maps of Alaska while he's there and see what he can dig up about that white area. As soon as he sits down with the maps, 2 men show up and tell him to leave it alone, which he did for about 20 years, until he finally reached out to Linda Moulton Howe, an American journalist who specializes in the paranormal and our weird world, to tell his story and officially go public. Linda goes on the Coast to Coast AM radio show and tells the whole story, including clips of her interview with Doug. As you might expect, afterward, Linda is contacted by a bunch of people with more information. One such whistleblower was Bruce Pearson, whose dad, Lee, told him a story of his brush with the triangle. Lee was a former military pilot who was friends with another former military pilot who had a supply run to make and asked Lee if he'd like to tag along. I gotta drop some stuff in the Alaska Triangle. We'll be there and back in like 3 to 4 hours tops. Trust me, this run is gonna get your heart pumping and make you feel like a kid again. Now, for those of you who've never heard of the Alaska Triangle, think Bermuda Triangle in Alaska, including missing planes, UFO sightings, and a missing persons rate twice that of the national average. Intrigued and ready for a nostalgic adrenaline rush, Lee says yes, and off the two go in the helicopter. About 5 miles out from their drop point, the pilot warns Lee, "Don't panic, but things are about to get a little crazy." Sure enough, all of the helicopter's instruments start failing, and the pilot lands using only eyesight and experience. Once they land, the cargo is offloaded and the helicopter refueled while the rotors are still spinning. Lee looks around and sees a lot of razor wire and heavily armed guards wearing all black with no insignias of any kind. They take off again the same way they landed, with no instruments, till about 5 miles out, everything goes back to normal. It's only later that the pilot explained to Lee just what that place is, that it houses an underground pyramid that supposedly generates enough energy to power all of Canada. Another witness tells Linda about his father's experience. His father, known only as M.B. Johnson, was an electrical engineer who served in the Navy and had more than a few top secret projects under his belt. He was flown from Nebraska to Alaska to work on another top secret project. After landing in Alaska and a 6-hour ride in a nondescript bus with blacked out windows, Mr. Johnson arrives at a military facility, takes an elevator ride down several floors, and is escorted through a huge, thick steel door where he sees, up close and personal, the Dark Pyramid. A massive pyramid made of dark stone, 550 feet tall, whose tip is just 150 feet below the Alaskan wilderness, built by who knows and who knows how many millennia ago. After his tour of working on the pyramid is over, Mr. Johnson returns to Nebraska, where he makes a replica of the pyramid out of aluminum, which then powers his entire farm. Another whistleblower who comes forward is a retired naval captain who had been stationed in Alaska. He noticed that aircraft always have instrument issues when they fly over this certain area just west of Denali. He also sees the news report of the pyramid-shaped object discovered because of the Chinese nuclear test. He puts 2 and 2 together and reports to his commander, "Hey, I bet this is the problem." His commander's response? "Mention another word of this again and you'll be facing a court-martial." And that's not all. There were even more people who came forward. Bruce Pearson, Lee Pearson's son, actually chartered a plane to go out looking for the pyramid himself, using coordinates that he thought were the location of the Dark Pyramid, but with no luck. Now, I hear you barking. What does any of this have to do with Nathan Campbell? Because Nathan is not your typical missing 411 case, as if those aren't weird enough. He went missing on a quest for the Dark Pyramid. On May 27th, 2020, Nathan, who lives in Wasilla, makes his way north to Talkeetna and hires a float plane pilot, Jason Sturgis, to fly him to Carey Lake, which is another 100 miles north on the other side of Denali. Nathan's plan is to spend 4 months in this area all on his own. Jason thinks it's kind of a weird place to spend your summer. That lake and the whole surrounding area is nothing but alderbrush thickets, which are a hiker's nightmare. You basically have to chop your way through. But he thinks, to each his own. Nathan is pretty quiet for most of the flight, but does share one thing, that he's going to Carrie Lake in search of the Dark Pyramid. Now things make a little bit more sense. Carrie Lake is only 8 miles north-northwest of the coordinates given for the location of the pyramid, and probably the closest place to those coordinates to land a plane. Bruce Pearson had no luck finding anything there when he was flying overhead, but the denseness of the thickets and the trees growing wild in the area could be hiding any signs of activity. But searching on foot is an entirely different beast. Jason drops Nathan on the shore of the lake and helps Nathan unload his gear. And looks to Jason like Nathan's well equipped for the 4 months he's planning to stay out there. Jason asks, "You sure you're good?" Nathan says, "Yep, I got this. I have a satellite phone to talk to my family if I need anything. Just come back and pick me up on September 15th. Jason flies away, not knowing he would be the last person to see Nathan alive. Nathan's wife loses contact with him around the middle of June, so only a couple of weeks after he gets there. She calls Jason, who tells her she should call a helicopter service to do a flyover of his last known satellite location. Now, I don't know if she did that or not, but Jason doesn't hear any more about it until he goes up there on the 15th for Nathan's pickup. Nathan's nowhere to be found. The National Park Service, or NPS, is called and a search is started. The NPS locates Nathan's campsite, but it looks like nobody's been there for months. They find his journal, which is mainly just entries of the everyday mundane chores of living off the grid, with his last entry being sometime around the end of June that simply states, "Went to get water." And not another trace of him is ever found. So what happened to him? Was he just some government secrets conspiracy theorist who needed an excuse to get out of the house for the summer, so he decided to follow the trail created by a bunch of loons looking for their 15 minutes of fame? Or maybe, is it possible he actually found it? Fun fact, the area of Alaska where the Dark Pyramid is supposedly located is equidistant to the major urban industrial centers of the Northern Hemisphere. That means a B-52 bomber with a full tank of gas can reach Tokyo, Beijing, Moscow, Paris, or even New York. That seems just slightly strategically important. So if you're the government and you have what seems to be some sort of ancient yet technologically advanced high energy device, for lack of a better term, in such a strategically important place, would you want anyone to know about it? We know what they say, dead men tell no tales. You know, I feel like this is not the only time in history that the government has tried to cover up some explosive discovery. No. Have any of you guys heard any good cover-up stories?
As a matter of fact, I have. While there are many good ones to share, I figured I'd share this one with you all. On the night of September 19th, 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were driving their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air through the winding roads of New Hampshire's White Mountains. It was around 10:30 at night, and the stretch of highway they were on was completely deserted. The couple was heading back from a short vacation in Canada, and they were eager to get home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Betty and Barney had been married for just about a year and a half at this point. Betty worked as a social worker, and Barney had a job at the post office. They were just a normal couple doing what normal couples do, taking a little vacation, driving home late at night, talking about mundane things like what they needed to get at the grocery store the next day. Now, as they drove along this dark, empty stretch of highway, Betty happened to look up through the windshield and noticed what looked like a really bright star moving across the sky. She didn't think much of it at the time, but after watching it for a few more seconds, she noticed this light wasn't moving the way stars typically moved. it seemed to be erratic, like it was dancing up there. And she pointed this out to her husband, and so he glanced up through his windshield. He figured it was probably just a satellite or maybe even a plane catching the moonlight at weird angles, but as they drove, both Betty and Barney kept watching, and they noticed it seemed to be getting bigger and brighter. Now, at some point, Barney was so amazed by this, he pulled the car over to the side of the road. He got out, took out his binoculars from the trunk, and he was a bit of a stargazer, so he always kept them handy. And when he looked up at the light through his binoculars, he knew that this wasn't just a point of light anymore. It was some kind of craft, and that it had a visible row of windows across it that were all lit up. And so he told Betty what he was seeing, and she quickly grabbed the binoculars to look for herself. And sure enough, she saw exactly what Barney had described, this craft with windows. But what really bothered both of them was that this object, whatever it was, seemed to be descending, and it was getting closer to them. So Barney got back in the car, started driving again, faster this time, but this object began following their vehicle. And every time Barney would speed up, this thing sped up. When he'd slow down, it would slow down. When he'd make a turn, it would make the same turn. And Betty and Barney were now driving as fast as they could along this mountain road, and this craft was matching their every move. Barney kept speeding up and then slowing down, trying to figure out if this thing was following them or if it was just their imagination. But there was no doubt this thing was deliberately tracking them. And at one point, Barney made a sharp turn onto a narrow side road, and it suddenly dropped down so low, it was only about 100 feet above their car. Barney could actually see the bright lights from inside the craft reflecting off the hood of their Chevy. Betty kept telling Barney to just keep driving. But Barney suddenly stopped the car right in the middle of the road, and before Betty could say anything, he jumped out of the car with his binoculars, and later, he would tell investigators that in that moment, he felt almost compelled to get out, like he couldn't control his own actions. Through his binoculars, he could now clearly see figures moving behind the windows of this craft. He could make out what looked like several beings wearing some kind of glossy black uniforms. They appeared to be looking right back at him. And that's when Betty and Barney both experienced something extremely strange. It was like someone had just switched off their consciousness. The next thing either of them knew, they were back in their car, but they were 35 miles further down the road. The time was now 5 in the morning. About 2 hours had somehow passed, but neither of them had any memory of what had happened during that time. And they were both extremely disoriented. Barney noticed his dress shoes were badly scuffed, even though they had been perfectly clean and polished earlier that evening. The strap on his binoculars was broken, and Betty's dress was torn in several places, and there were these strange, shiny spots on them that hadn't been there before. Barney's wristwatch had stopped working, so when he took it off to look at it more closely, there were these weird circular marks on his wrist that he had never seen. His neck was also killing him, but he had no idea why. And when Betty and Barney finally got home that morning, they were both completely exhausted, but something was really off. Betty went straight to the bathroom, and she noticed these perfectly round, quarter-sized bruises all over her neck that had not been there before. They didn't hurt, which was strange, but they formed this weird pattern. Meanwhile, Barney was in their bedroom taking off his clothes when he realized his lower back was hurting. When he checked in the mirror, he saw these strange marks, like surgical scars, but they were already healed over like they had been months old. He hadn't had a surgery, and these marks were not there before. Betty called out to Barney to come look at the compass in their car. Something was different. When they went outside to check, they found the compass was spinning wildly, never settling on north. And this is the same compass they'd used on their entire trip to Canada without any issues. And so the next day, neither of them went to work. They just sat at their kitchen table, drinking cup after cup of coffee, trying to piece together what had happened. Betty kept writing things down in a notebook, just trying to document everything they could remember. She noted that both their watches were exactly 2 hours behind, and both had stopped working at the same time, 10:46 p.m. Barney was unusually quiet. He kept rubbing his neck and staring off into space, and at one point, he tried to call their family doctor about the pain, but when the receptionist asked what had happened, he couldn't explain it. He just hung up. That afternoon, they decided to drive back up to where they thought they had had their experience, but as soon as they got near the White Mountains, Barney started feeling physically sick. His hands were shaking so bad he couldn't steer the car, and they were forced to turn around and go back home. These sections, over the next few days, Betty and Barney tried to go about their normal lives, but something just wasn't right. Betty began having these vivid, terrifying nightmares, and in these dreams, she kept seeing someone in some kind of bright room, but she could never remember the details when she woke up. Barney, who had never had anxiety before, suddenly started having panic attacks at work. He couldn't concentrate on sorting mail at the post office. His hands would just start shaking, and that pain in his neck would not go away. The couple noticed other weird things. When Benny went to hang up the dress she'd worn that night, she saw those odd circular stains. She tried washing them out, but nothing would remove them. The dress was basically ruined. They also realized they couldn't drive at night anymore. Anytime they saw headlights in the rearview mirror, both of them would start to panic. They began taking different routes to work, avoiding that stretch of highway in the White Mountains completely. After about 10 agonizing days of this, Betty called her sister and flat out told her what happened. Her sister suggested they contact Pease Air Force Base to report what they'd seen. When Betty did call the base, the person who answered the phone connected her to Major Paul Henderson. This was a man who listened to their story and filed an official report, but his conclusion was that the hills had probably seen Jupiter or some other bright planet. This explanation made no sense to Betty and Barney. They knew what they saw wasn't a planet. Planets don't exactly follow cars down mountain roads. So they just tried to forget about the whole thing. Except the nightmares and anxiety kept getting worse, and Betty was barely sleeping. Barney's neck pain had gotten so bad he could hardly turn his head. And so at one point, a friend recommended they see a psychiatrist named Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston. Now, Dr. Simon at the time specialized in treating trauma through hypnosis. He told the Hills that whatever happened that night, their minds had clearly blocked it out. But those memories were still there, just buried in their subconscious, and that's what was causing all their symptoms. So he decided to hypnotize Betty and Barney separately. He didn't want them in the same room during their sessions because he was worried they might influence each other's memories. But what came out during these separate sessions was something that would change their lives. Under hypnosis, both Betty and Barney described being forced to stop their car by a group of beings on the road. These beings were short, maybe about 5 feet tall, with large heads and huge wraparound eyes. Their skin was grayish, and they had very small mouths that didn't move when they communicated. Barney then described being horrified when they approached their car. He told Dr. Simon that they somehow made him and Benny get out of the car and walk into the woods. The beings were communicating with them, but not by talking. It was like they were putting thoughts directly into their heads. And during his session, Barney became extremely agitated when he described being taken aboard some kind of ship. He told Dr. Simon about being laid out on the table while these things examined him. They seemed fascinated by his dentures. They'd never seen anything like them before. They took samples of his skin and performed other tests that Barney found extremely painful. Betty's separate hypnosis sessions revealed almost identical details about the beings in the ship. She described being in a room with curved walls and bright lights. The beings performed what they told her was a pregnancy test, which involved inserting a long needle into her navel. One detail that came out during her sessions was bizarre. She said one of the beings showed her a star map. It asked her if she knew where she was on the map, but Betty told them she had no idea. After her session, she drew the map exactly as she remembered seeing it. And during these hypnosis sessions, both Betty and Barney would become extremely emotional. I mean, they were reliving a trauma. They would sometimes start crying and shaking. Dr. Simon noted how genuine their reactions were. I mean, they were clearly reliving something that had just deeply shaken them. But perhaps the most striking thing to Dr. Simon was how closely their stories matched. Even though they were hypnotized separately and had no way of knowing what the other person had said, either they were both telling the truth or they had somehow created the exact same elaborate false memory. After the hypnosis sessions were complete, Dr. Simon spent months analyzing everything Betty and Barney had told him. This was a man who was practical. He didn't believe in UFOs or aliens, but he couldn't understand how this couple had independently come up with the exact same story, down to the most tiniest of details. That star map Betty had drawn was really weird. In fact, in 1968, an amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish decided to study it. She spent hours making models of different star systems, trying to match them to Betty's drawing. and eventually, she found something that shocked her. Betty's map seemed to show a pattern that matched perfectly with the Zeta Reticuli star system, which wasn't even properly mapped until years after Betty had drawn it. But the Hill story also attracted a lot of skeptics. People pointed out that just before their experience, a TV movie called The Invaders from Mars had aired, and it had some similar elements to what this couple had described. Others suggested that because Betty and Barney were an interracial couple in the 1960s, which was pretty rare back then and looked down upon, unfortunately, it could have been stress-induced, and that this caused a stress-induced delusion of some kind. But, if they hadn't gone public with their story, somebody surely would have leaked it to the press. And after that, newspapers and TV shows kept calling them for interviews. People would show up at their house unannounced, wanting to talk about aliens. Some people even accused them of making the whole thing up for attention and money. They just tried their best to live their lives as best they could. Now, in 1969, Barney died from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was only 46, which is pretty young. And some people try to connect his death to what had happened that night, suggesting that whatever medical procedures the beings had performed on him might have contributed to his early death. Betty lived until she was 85, and after Barney died, she became more open to talking about what really happened. She actually ended up giving lectures and interviews just trying to help anyone who had had a similar experience. But she always maintained that she and Barney never wanted any of this attention. They just wanted to understand what had happened to them. And even to this day, the Betty and Barney Hill case remains one of the most thoroughly documented and credible UFO encounters ever reported. What makes it most compelling is the star map, really. It's really strange. And even now, more than 60 years later, no one has been able to fully explain what happened to Betty and Barney Hill on that dark mountain road in New Hampshire. Sadly, their story became the template for thousands of other alien abduction stories that would follow. Theirs remains unique. Okay, so it's not exactly a cover-up story. Maybe, just maybe, there were some details that were redacted before the public gained knowledge of it.
Wow, Josh, Carol Ann, Mike, those were all incredible. You guys are something else doing storytelling. But I got one here that could get all of your hearts pumping and your blood boiling. Check this one out. I have a dogman story that I could tell you one way in about 2 minutes, and that version, though, has no emotional impact. I want to tell you the proper way, so I better go back to the very beginning and tell you something in the version of if I were telling you this was my story. So, my little pet husky Malamute dog, I named him Morley after this weird old dude that my father used to watch on TV. If you frighten easily, then you might want to skip the rest of this story entirely. Although, if you scare easily, you probably wouldn't be on this channel to start with. So, we found Morley in the backyard, and we put out a food and water bowl, and he basically became our dog. Mostly, he preferred to sleep outside, even in the cold. That is that breed of dog. We did on occasion, though, however, try to bring him in the house when it was extreme cold, and he would allow us to do that sometimes. We even tried to bring him to the vet once. That didn't go very well. We bought him a lot of dog food and chewy toys and things of that nature, which were basically strewn about his yard. He liked to come and go as he pleased, and we know he had several other families feeding him too. My dad would always say, that Morley, he's a smart dog. He's got other families taking care of him too. So back to me. I was a super uncoordinated and gangly kid. I took up studying guitar to force myself to do one thing with my left hand and another with my right. I used to trip over my own feet walking up the stairs sometimes. I was such a disaster, but I did go to a gym and try to do specific exercises to help build some strength. Back then, as you would expect, it made me a likely target of bullies, being gangly and uncoordinated. One time I was walking home from school, and these 3 kids who did not live in my neighborhood were following me. They were taunting me with real threats and making me feel basically terrified. I was only about a block from my house, but I really didn't want them to know where I lived because they were telling me how bad they were going to make life for me and my family. I wanted to cry, like when one of these bullies moved past the taunts to violence. He shoved me down onto the sidewalk, and that's when I curled into a ball and I prepared to get beaten up. But after a few seconds, I realized nobody was hurting me or even close to me, but I was hearing crying and screaming. Disoriented, I sat up and saw my dog Morley tearing one kid's jacket off his body. He then started to bite another of the 2 bullies. One boy was screaming for me to help him. His voice was higher pitched than a girl, and I asked him, "What are you going to do for me if I save you from my dog?" He just cursed at me a whole bunch of nasty words that I wasn't allowed to say myself because I'd get in trouble. So I just shrugged my shoulders and kicked the guy in the neck, just somewhat lightly. And then I motioned to Morley and said, "Sick a boy, get him here, Morley, get him." And I heard that kid screaming, and I heard Morley having a great time as I walked the rest of the way home with a little smile of satisfaction and strength. Don't worry, the kid survived. Morley wasn't a man-eater, but from that day on, those bullies gave me a wide berth of space. They never told anybody that my dog attacked them. It really was Morley, my dog, anyway. He came and went as he pleased. I didn't ask him to attack those jerks. He made that decision all on his own. For years growing up, Morley had become my protector, my best friend. And he made sure that we had a tough reputation and no one ever messed with me again. I used to call Morley a werewolf or a wolfman because sometimes he would stand up on his hind legs and hug me. He started off taller than me, and I was about equal in height to him by the time I had to go away to college. Then, right when I was getting ready to go, the worst thing happened. He passed away the week before I left for my dorm room. Man, that was the saddest day of my life. He was more special to me than any human I had ever met. He was like having a superhero for a friend. My superhero friend. He had left me with a physical sense that I had internalized much of Morley's attitudes and personality over the years. When I encountered bullies in college, I found their weaknesses and I managed to cope with relatively little conflict. My internal mentor was that husky Malamute superhero dog that I had once known, and I would say that I followed my own internal canine feeling throughout most of my life. For years, it never steered me wrong, and I ended up happily married with 2 beautiful children. As you know, during the pandemic, we were being advised to cover our faces and with masks put those things on for however long, and then to put our kids on a Zoom call instead of sending them to school. My wife, Whitney, and I decided to buy a trailer, a Winnebago. We decided that the 4 of us could live out of this Winnebago and then hit the road. We would travel the country and give our kids a real education in the real world. So rather than locking down, we opened up both our lives and minds and we hit the road. We started off driving south from the suburb of Cleveland that we live in. By the winter, we found ourselves in Johnstown, PA. It's a very hard-working class place, and my wife's uncle, a very hard-working class man, lived there, so we dropped in for a visit. He prepared us a fantastic lunch and tried to convince us to stay the night. But we were hoping to get down to the Laurel Ridge State Park, which is a bit to the southwest. So off we went, driving towards the camping park. The snow started falling. At first, it was so beautiful and serene. Even the kids quieted down to watch the huge flakes. We were driving on Route 271 through Pennsylvania, which is really in the middle of nowhere. This is exactly what we wanted, a family trip, connecting with nature and a feeling of peacefulness. But that all changed then in the next second. I saw what I immediately recognized as a mythical beast. It was a Pennsylvania dogman running out onto the slippery road and skidding in front of our speeding camper. There was no way for me to have stopped that Winnebago, even if the road had been dry. I did hit the brakes, but then the huge heavy vehicle containing my family and everything we held dear hydroplaned and slid down the 2-lane highway. We were swerving back and forth. I tried to force our momentum to slow, and I felt the camper tip to the left, to the right. If we lost balance and tipped over, that might be the end of us all. The creature in question stepped down onto the road toward my left, so I chose to turn to the right and try to drive off the road. As I did, so too did another man-sized canine-headed creature walk out in front of our vehicle. No matter what I did, I was going to hit something. So I chose to turn even further to the right and hope that one or more of the trees at the edge of the woods would stop our fall down the hill and not damage the trailer too badly, but more importantly, save my family. In fact, I sort of did succeed in doing that, but it's just that the vehicle had tipped maybe 20 or 25 degrees to the right. The only thing keeping us from tipping further and rolling down the hill was one or two of the bigger trees. I could already hear the trees cracking and a sense of panic setting in. I felt fully alert and ready to do whatever was necessary. But I wasn't sure what to do exactly. My wife, she shouted in panic, and then our kids, of course, erupted into crying and screaming. My hand shook that I felt useless. Everything that I had always remembered learning from my canine friend, all of it was gone. I was pathetic and frightened, unable to save my own family. Outside, one of the monsters walked in my direction. I became so scared that I almost felt like I was going to lose control of my limbs and my breathing. He was a big man-like monster of a wolf man swaggering over to me more than walking. The odd thing is, when I noticed that, it sort of calmed me down. He wasn't acting like a freak. He wasn't behaving in a manic way, which I certainly was. He seemed a lot calmer than me. Then the dogman leaped up a bit and grabbed at my window, which was leaning over to the right. I screamed, thinking he was trying to get in, and I moved further to my right. That caused the entire vehicle to slide just a little bit more on the road, leaving us by then probably 30 degrees to the right of where we wanted to be. I could see the dog-headed men moving around outside, and I wondered what they were doing. See, I told you about 2 of them, but now there were 3. It seemed as though they had some sort of primitive form of communication, and that they were working out a plan. Were they going to remove 1 or 2 of the trees, causing us to crash down the hill? Then I heard the dogman moving around on that exact side, the side of the forest, the side we were tipping over onto. I could hear branches and even tree trunks snapping and cracking. We all shrieked in horror. My wife looked out that side and told me all the hairy monster men were pushing on the camper in unison. We started to sway back and forth, a little left, a little right, more to the left, and so on, until all of a sudden, bam, we had all 4 wheels on the ground. I hit the gas pedal and we rolled right back up onto the flat ground, my front end sticking out a bit into the lane on the road. The kids cheered and my wife openly wept. I needed to catch my breath, and I hoped the dogman didn't save us just to eat us now. I was too emotional to drive. I physically just couldn't do it. For a minute, I sat there gasping for air and trying to calm down. Then I saw the swaggering, hairy monster dog walking back over to me. He looked at me with this really weird, but very familiar expression on his face. It was the same as my old dog Morley used to make. I realized that this dog looked like a Malamute and Husky mix also, except that neither Malamutes or Huskies are able to stand up on their hind legs and walk around like a badass action movie star. He was definitely the alpha one, and he came over and he licked me on my face. Yes. As my family screamed in horror, my wife was babbling about how now that monster had the taste of man on his tongue, and it was our responsibility to put him down before he ate everyone else in the state. I was trying to block her out and understand what was actually happening. The dog man was moving his head to the side in a really strange way over and over again as he looked at me like, what dogs do. That was what Morley used to do when he wanted me to scratch him behind the ear. He would turn his head and kind of motion to me. I was so wrapped up in that moment, I did reach out of the car, which caused several of the dog men outside to adopt a hostile posturing. The growling loud enough to be heard inside the Winnebago. I did start to give him a little air scratch, and he started to push hard, making my arm feel like he was going to break it off. The other upright canines appeared fidgety and uncomfortable through this, but they weren't growling anymore. I finally got all the big creature's itchy spots, and he dropped to the ground and scratched himself just a little bit more, the same way Morley always used to finish our ear-rubbing rituals. Satisfied, the big dog man ran on all fours into the woods on the other side of Route 271 in Appalachia. The other dogs, yipping loudly in excitement, followed him enthusiastically. And as the last of those other dogmen disappeared in the woods, I saw the alpha one last time. He was staring at me. He gave me a almost kind of human-like nod. And then he turned back and boop, gone, zip, never seen him again. The dogmen were gone, but we are still to this day cataloging all the ways in which that encounter changed our lives forever. For my wife, of course, it's all horror and terror. But for me and the kids, this has been a world and eye-opening experience now. The two of them are into dogman and monster stories. They tell me stuff about cryptids that I didn't even know. They're going to be experts before long. I'm so proud of them. And of course, none of the rest of my family can ever understand the deep and emotional impact this experience had on me. Do I think it was the reincarnation, or at least in some sense, of my old dog Morley that came and saved us? While I don't understand the world well enough to say it couldn't have been him, I would like to believe in my heart that it was Morley, and he is there looking down on me. Well, that's it, everybody. What do you think about that experience? I was extremely touched, and I hope you like how I did the rendition for the emailer who sent that in. Check out this next story, guys. It's going to blow your mind.
Wow, Matt, that was an absolutely crazy and very interesting story as well. Which reminds me about my last story I'll be telling today, that is intertwined with one of the most mysterious stories ever to be told. Now, everybody, before I begin, comment right now what you think the most mysterious story ever told was. Just pause it for 1 second, start typing. All right, let's go. So in 1993, 7 hikers were trekking near Lake Baikal in Siberia when they suddenly were overcome with these truly horrific symptoms. I mean, blood streamed from their eyes and their noses as they clutched their throats and bashed their heads against rock. And if you have been watching stories like this for a long time, I'm sure you have heard of Dyatlov Pass. And if you love that story, or you never heard of it, maybe you haven't heard of this one. Get ready, this one could literally be a movie. Okay, first let's start off with the Dyatlov Pass. I'm sure most of you have heard about this, and I've tried to find similar stories to this, as it remains one of the most intriguing mysteries ever, and I mean ever. And some of you might know in California, the Yuba 5 is known as America's Dyatlov Pass, which I've done a story on it as well, but now I found a part 3 to the Dyatlov Pass anthology. And for those of you that might remember the original Dyatlov Pass, great, but for those who don't, well, that story starts high up in the forbidden peaks of Russia's Ural Mountains. 9 students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute fought their way through these harsh snows, determined to conquer aka Dead Mountain. And at the head of their hike was Igor Dyatlov, respected as one of the Institute's hardiest outdoor enthusiasts. But little did they know their bold venture was doomed to end in one of Russia's most horrific unsolved mysteries. The date was February 1st, 1959, when the group set out to scale Mount Ortorten in the northern part of the range. Now, this was not your average hike. This was rated a Category 3 hike, reserved only for experts, and the route was, no casual trek. And this trek was for all of them in hiking to get their Category 3, which, is equivalent in the Boy Scouts to an Eagle Scout. It's like the highest honor you can get. And all of these hikers had extensive mountaineering experience under challenging winter conditions. Spirits were high when they pitched their large tents in the snowy lower slopes and settled in after an 11-mile day. But in a shocking series of events that soon plunged their expedition into disaster and left 9 inexplicably dead by morning. And when the group failed to return, these search teams set out only to find an abandoned tent, ripped and torn as if it was butchered with knives. Footprints showed the entire party had inexplicably fled the shelter into the wilderness, registering minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and without proper clothing or footwear, as if gripped by a madness that overrode all survival instinct. Dyatlov and his followers had rushed half-dressed from the tent to their freezing death yards away. I mean, it took searchers 2 agonizing weeks of combing remote snowbound forests before locating the first grim remains nearly a mile downslope. And the subsequent autopsies painted an appalling picture of the hikers' demise. They all showed signs of disorientation and mental trauma preceding their death, which 6 of them met from hypothermia while exhibiting undressing as severe cold set in. 3 others, though, had sustained massive internal injuries akin to a catastrophic car crash. I mean, team leader Dyatlov himself suffered lethal skull damage and major chest fractures, comparable to being smashed by incredible pressures. Yet no external wounds or signs of struggle could explain such damage. Only stresses like psychological shock or attack by high levels of force provided plausible causes. And this gruesome mutilation spoke of intentional human intelligence behind the act, as no animal migrating there was capable of doing it. The 9 deaths themselves invited bewilderment enough, but other uncanny factors deepened this mystery. Among the party's few recovered belongings, some items of clothing emitted inexplicable trace radiation. Even more bizarre, right? Observers in adjacent regions reported bizarre, odd orange glowing spheres hovering in the skies above Dead Mountain the night that the doomed hikers perished. Were military experiments behind this mystery, or had some hostile tribe ambushed them as they sheltered in their tent? Well, a diary entry discovered months later in a sealed roll of film only fueled uneasy speculation. It said, "From now on, we know the snowmen exist. They can be met in the northern Urals." Now, if you want to watch the full story on the Dyatlov Pass, which, you know, there's a lot to cover, you can check it out through all of our catalogs, because I'm pretty sure we have all done it. Okay, and all of that brings us nearly 35 years after that shocking 1959 incident, because the riddle of Dead Mountain repeated itself with awful echoes half a continent away across the Kamar-Daban mountain range of southern Siberia. And that's where this story starts on August 5th, 1993. There in the dense pine forest of the Kamar-Daban range, 41-year-old Lyudmila Korovina paused to catch her breath with her students hiking in the group that she was in charge of. I'm sorry if I butcher all these names, but the group consisted of 17 through 20-year-olds. Sasha Krysin, Timer Bapanov, Victoria Zailsova, Valentina Valya Utachenko, Tatiana Filipenko, and Denis Shavakin. Korovina was hoping to provide them with the wilderness challenge of a lifetime, and neither of these groups could have imagined the shocking mysteries that awaited before them. And Korovina was no amateur. She was revered for her robust survival skills honed for decades of leading these type of exhibitions. And her young pupils looked up to her with admiration. One of them was even quoted saying that she believed in people. She could make a person become who they really were and who they really wanted to be. And even though her group now was inexperienced, they were eager to prove themselves under Korovina's intense teaching as they set out from Merino Village on August 2nd. Korovina would act like a mentor and a friend to them when they would set up camp, like she usually did. Also, she was fierce and great at what she did, and always liked to test her students just about to their limit, and then it seemed she always knew where that limit was. But once they embarked on this journey, there was no looking back, and Korovina led them out of the village with the same mentality as an officer taking their troops into battle. They had a mission and a destination, and Korovina was going to make sure that they completed it. Now, despite this being an arduous journey, the first 2 days went smoothly as they could be, especially as good weather empowered them to make excellent time to the 2,396 meter summit, which is about 7,861 feet tall. But their fortunes rapidly deteriorated. August 4th brought relentless rain that exhausted the team, and at that moment, night was falling as the winds intensified, and the first remnants of a cyclone storm was lashing at the mountainside. But as an Ironman triathlete and a veteran outdoor guide with 20 years of experience, Korovina had faced and conquered worse than this many times before. But her instincts warned of a storm that warranted caution, so she quickly gathered her group to descend below the tree line before full fury struck. Because if they made it there, they could actually, take shelter, build fires, and live out the passing storm in relative safety. Yet, despite generations of woodland lore, the woman who was long hailed among Russia's elite wilderness experts for some unknown reason chose to do otherwise. To the bafflement of everybody that knows this case, Korovina inexplicably directed her group toward a barren ridge offering horrible cover from the impending storm that came in as a roaring, powerful vortex of snow. So you might already think, was some of her thinking off, and if so, why? And it was at this moment that they were in a bleak and hostile place that was rocky and barren, kind of resembling the moon in some ways. And these shrieking winds just pounded them through the endless night as icy rains drenched them to the core. And lacking all power to spark a life-saving fire, they huddled together, shivering as hypothermia slowly drained away their strength. And as dawn was finally approaching, the group of hikers were about to go through something that a lot of people can only explain as paranormal. You see, as they got going, Chryson, who was lingering in the back of the group, suddenly let out this blood-curdling scream, and blood spurted from his eyes and ears, mixing with froth as he convulsed violently on the ground. So Korovina just rushed to his side, desperately trying to revive him, but it was too late. His body went still, a grotesque expression of agony frozen on his face. And as she knelt over his lifeless form, Korovina felt the sharp pain shoot right through her own body. And she screamed in terror as blood began to pour from her own eyes and mouth as well. She collapsed then onto Chryson's body, her limbs contorting in violent spasms. At this point, Filipenko, who had been by Korovino's side, also fell victim to whatever horror had befallen them. She clutched at her throat, gasping for air that just wouldn't come. So with desperate determination, she crawled to a nearby rock, but then slammed her head against it until the pain subsided and she went limp. And as she lay still, Zalsova and Bapanov took off running, their bodies also convulsing and contorting in agony. And then they collapsed in a heap, blood pouring from their mouths as they clawed at their throats and ripping apart their own clothes. Shavakin and Yudichenko didn't have time to react before they too were struck by the same violent illness. But Yudichenko managed to escape, running down the treacherous mountain terrain as fast as her trembling legs could carry her. And then she set up a tent for the night under the cover of trees, exhausted but too terrified to sleep. And when she finally returned to the site of her friend's horrific deaths the next day, she could barely bring herself to retrieve the supplies that she needed from their lifeless bodies to go on and survive. And then for 4 harrowing days, Yudichenko pushed on, following these power lines down the mountain in a desperate bid for help. The only thing at this point that was keeping her going was the hope that someone would find her before it was too late. And then finally she stumbled upon a river and then began to follow it. And on August 9th, after what felt like an eternity of fear and suffering, Yudichenko was discovered by a group of Ukrainian kayakers. She was weak and delirious, and she was taken to the nearest police station where a report was filed detailing her incredible survival against all odds. Yudichenko from there was silent, not a peep, for days. And the official search on 24th of August was held by Yuri Golias. And it took 2 days and helicopters to find the bodies due to Yudichenko not being able to speak just yet. And the hikers were partially undressed when found, and they had signs of bruised lungs, and an autopsy determined that 5 died from hypothermia, but for some reason Korovina died of a heart attack. So what could have happened? Well, in the Dyatlov Pass incident, some cited UFOs seen hovering around Dead Mountain, and they took that as evidence of extraterrestrial activity affecting probably their minds and bodies. But the theories of this story with Korovina at the site now known as the Kamar Daban incident, and also known as the Bryachia's Dyatlov Pass, and numerous theories have been proposed to explain the tragic death of the hikers. Valery Tartanikov and Vladimir Zinov, who took part in the search for the bodies, argued that hypothermia was not a factor. Zinov even suggested altitude sickness as a possible cause. And then a tourist, Vladimir Borzenkov, and search team member Nikolai Fedorov believed that the infrasounds may have driven the hikers to madness. And Yuri, the leader of the search operation, accused instructor Korovina of neglect and starving her students, leading to a vitamin deficiency. However, Yudachenko rejected this theory in a 2018 interview. And the autopsy reports offered a chilling conclusion that the hikers died from hypothermia after enduring a freezing night without proper shelter. But a lot believe there is way more to this story that perhaps meet the eye. I mean, perhaps they were victims of something far more sinister and calculated. Because whispers of a military experiment hover over this tragedy, suggesting the hikers stumbled upon a top-secret operation in the desolate mountains. So was their brutal demise an effort to keep this experiment hidden from the world? And if so, what other horrors could be lurking in these isolated peaks? And as theories continue to swirl, one question remains. Were these hikers just unfortunate victims or casualties of a merciless government agenda? The truth may never be fully known, as conflicting reports and possible cover-ups cloud any chance for closure. But one thing is for certain, this was no ordinary camping trip gone wrong. And the symptoms described by Yudachenko are eerily similar to those of death by nerve agents. The frothing at the mouth and the convulsions, a hallmark of strong nerve agent poisoning, paint a gruesome picture of their final moments. And the telltale bruising on their lungs could only be explained by exposure to deadly nerve gas, causing respiratory distress and eventual cardiac arrest, just like Korovina's cause of death. But it doesn't end there, because Novichok, a family of nerve agents known to be the deadliest in existence, was reportedly tested in the nearby area of Kamar Daban. So could the hikers have unknowingly stumbled upon a testing site leading to their horrific demise? Or perhaps it was something else entirely. There's a lake nearby, Lake Baikal, known as a toxic waste dumping ground. And some think that that could have contaminated the water supply that the hikers drank from. And ingesting these toxins would not have shown up in a standard toxicology report and could have caused their hallucinations and sickness. Another chilling theory suggests that one of the hikers may have accidentally consumed poisonous mushrooms foraged by Korovina, who was known to teach her students this art as well. Some speculate that a student preparing the breakfast for the day could have accidentally put psilocybin mushrooms in there by mistake, and a lot of it. An overdose of psilocybin can lead to psychosis, convulsions, cardiac arrest, and even send someone into a coma. All possible explanations for the terrifying events that took place on that fateful hike. And the common hallucination caused by psilocybin? Well, it's seeing other people crying blood. A haunting detail that cannot be ignored in this tragic and mysterious case. Yet still others blamed tribes, long rumored to dwell hidden within the Siberian mountain vastness, guarding these strange secrets. Others say it could have been the ancient Arctic demons known to the Siberian Inuit from the past that was so long ago that people today almost have little or no knowledge or memory of it, preying on trespassers who strayed too far into their lair. Let me know in the comments if one of those is what you believe, or if you believe something totally different. And more renewed interest in 2021 came about when Russian media, blog coverage, was arguing evidence that still points to bizarre weapons experiments, potentially Cold War mind-altering technology, or some stealth-directed energy test gone awry. Either way you look at it, one thing is for certain. Don't try to go on an expedition to Dead Mountain or Kamar-Daban mountain range in Siberia. But then again, my bloodline is from Siberia, so maybe my ancestors have already climbed that treacherous mountain, but for some reason they survived. Or maybe my ancestors are the ones guarding those secrets. I mean, isn't it just amazing that all of this started with the Diyala Pass and to become a Category 3 hiker? I mean, it truly is amazing how a chain of events, especially in a mysterious way, can unravel. I mean, Category 3 hiker, that sounds really hard to get. I mean, I kind of wish that I joined the Boy Scouts when my brother was in it and became, an Eagle Scout, because, that sounds like a high badge of honor as well. I mean, maybe that would even compare to what a Category 3 hiker is. Who knows, though, because then again, I'm actually not sure what it even takes to become an Eagle Scout.
I can tell you exactly how to get an Eagle Scout badge. You have to do a public service project, which is exactly what Josh, not you, Josh, and his friends were attempting to accomplish before their plans went a little off the rails. It's the summer of 2008, and Josh is a lifelong Boy Scout trying to become an Eagle Scout. For those of you not familiar with this process, a Boy Scout has to pick a service project to show that he's not only trying to better himself, but his community as well. So Josh decides he wants to clean up the Sam Crocker Cemetery, which is in Dent Township in the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. So one Saturday, Josh loads up 3 of his friends, his little brother and his little brother's friend, into his Jeep Cherokee, and all 6 of them head to the cemetery around 11 a.m. The plan is that they would stay for 5 or 6 hours with the 4 older boys working on the cemetery, while the 2 younger ones go fishing in nearby Cordis Creek, just a little north of the cemetery. Being the good Boy Scouts that they are, they have food for lunch, the tools they need, everything. They're all set. Josh drops the little brother and his friend at the creek first, so it's about 11:30 or so before the older boys get to work on their project. Now remember, the cemetery is in the middle of Mark Twain National Forest, and around 1:30, they get a visit from some park rangers. Now keep in mind that Josh and his family and his Boy Scout troop all spend a lot of time camping and stuff in the area, so they actually know the rangers and the rangers know them. Josh explains his project, and the park rangers say, "Great! In that case, we'll leave you to your work, and if you need anything, let us know. We're going to be in the area today." Great. So the boys get back to work, and a little while later, one of the boys is on the edge of the cemetery mending a fence when he sees something off in the distance. He makes his way over to Josh and tells him he thinks he saw a bear, and it was heading in the direction of where the younger boys are fishing. And bear sightings are not exactly uncommon in that area, so Josh says, "No problem. Let's take a ride up there. We can pick them up and bring them back for lunch, and then they can fish on the south end instead after lunch." So that's what they do. The cemetery has this little shelter area with benches where the boys sit and eat their lunch. And the boy who had been mending the fence realizes he forgot his jacket, so he takes off through the cemetery back over to the fence that he was fixing so he can grab his jacket. When he gets about halfway there, he's hit with this awful stench, something between rotten eggs and an outhouse. He keeps going to get his jacket, and the smell fades. And on his way back to the shelter, it hits him again. He thinks, "What is that? It wasn't there when we first got here." So when he gets back to the shelter, he tells Josh there is an unbelievable stink in the air in the middle of the cemetery. And immediately, Josh thinks, no, this is his project and he doesn't want anything to go wrong. And he's thinking, did we accidentally disturb a body or something? So he gets up, takes the same walk his friend had just taken, trying to locate the source of the smell. And he smells it in the middle. Wow! not so much on the far side fence, and then back in the middle again. So he walks around some more and notices it's a little stronger on the east side by Highway 80. So he jumps the fence and goes out to the highway to see if there's roadkill or something along the road. Nothing. So he turns back and starts heading back to the shelter when he sees everyone at the shelter is standing and they're shouting something. He's not entirely sure, but he thinks they're yelling, "Hurry up." And he thinks, well, everyone must be done with lunch and my brother's probably in a hurry to get back to fishing. But as he gets closer, he sees that they're actually switching between looking at him and looking at something to Josh's right in the tree line. Josh follows where they're looking and sees what they see. A silhouette in the woodline, kind of pacing back and forth. And immediately he thinks, well, that's gotta be the bear that was hanging out from before. Thankfully, he paid attention to Boy Scout survival class, so he knew running was a bad idea. The bear is to his right, and his friends and brother are in front of him. So even if he starts to run toward his friends, the bear will start running toward all of them. So he decides, I'll just keep calmly walking toward them, then we'll all calmly get in the car and we'll honk the horn till it goes away. But once he gets to about 20 to 30 feet from them, he yells, "Get in the car!" He looks to his right to see what the bear is doing and sees that it's not a bear. It's standing on two legs. It's dark brown or black in color with tall ears on the top of its head. And when it hears Josh yell, it stops pacing, drops to all fours, and starts running directly at them. They all pile into the Jeep as Josh starts it up and starts driving out of the cemetery. But the road is not a great road, and Josh has a hard time negotiating the Jeep around some of the fallen trees and rocks. His little brother, who's only like 11 or 12, is crying and screaming, "It's catching us!" Josh glances into the rearview mirror and sees what looks like a jet black German Shepherd, except for the fact that it's the size of a small horse. Its eyes are red, not like LED bright light red, but like a soft red glow. He speeds up as much as he can, takes another look in the mirror, and it's gone. His friends start screaming, "Holy crap! What the hell was that?" Josh looks off to his left and sees this beast cutting through the field on what is now a collision course with the Jeep. And he's thinking, well, if I have to hit it, I have to hit it. I'm not stopping. As the two objects in motion get closer and closer, Josh says it's like time slows down. He watches as the beast leaps into the air and with uncanny precision lands right on the hood of the Jeep. Josh's automatic reaction is to slam on the brakes, sending this thing tumbling off the hood onto the ground in front of them. But it stands right back up and looks right at the boys inside. This creature in front of them stands about 6 feet tall, weighs about 200 pounds, and is covered head to toe in a mix of jet black and brown fur. And those red eyes. They weren't glowing like light bulbs, but they were shining like eyes do when caught in headlights, except the Jeep did not have its lights on. And while Josh is trying to process this thing standing right in front of him that's not supposed to exist, the rest of the boys in the Jeep are yelling, "Go, go, go!" With his foot on the brake, he's thinking, do I hit this thing? What if it wrecks the car? Then we're stuck. Or what if it comes through the windshield? So he chooses a more cautious approach. He gives the Jeep a little gas, just a little lurch forward, and lays on the horn, hoping it will scare away like smart animals do. And all the while, he's still trying to figure out what it is that he's seeing. He can't hear anything because the other boys are still screaming at him, but Josh never takes his eyes off of this thing. And to his amazement, the thing's lips curl in a snarl that, if he didn't know better, looked like a smile. It was like it couldn't help but be amused by Josh's indecision. Josh gives the Jeep a little more gas, honking the horn again, moving ever so slightly closer. But now, he's so close that he has no choice but to hit it if he wants to get out of there. But he also knows that if he does hit it, he's probably not even going to hurt this thing. It's more likely that he'll just piss it off and it'll come after them all for sure. He's running out of options. Once his mind gets to about option K, he puts the Jeep in reverse and punches it, making everyone else in the car totally panic that he's going the wrong way. He looks back at the beast, who is no longer smiling as it drops to all fours. Josh slams the Jeep back into drive and punches it, trying to gain as much speed as he can as he's heading right for the creature. But right before they collide, the beast jumps up and to the driver's side as they pass by in a narrow miss. Josh keeps going, knowing that they're going to hit Highway 80 in just a little bit, when his little brother, who's all the way in the back of the Jeep, screams, "It's on the back door!" Josh looks in his rearview mirror to see that this thing has grabbed onto the bumper and the top rack and is trying to climb onto the Jeep. They go over a bump to get onto Highway 80, and Josh hopes it'll be enough to knock this thing off the Jeep. But no luck. So he keeps going. Just a little ahead, Highway 80 joins up to Highway Z at a kind of a weird angle that if you're going north on Z, it's a pretty gentle turn. But south is a harder angle to navigate. Which direction do they live? South. Josh doesn't want to stop, so he decides he'll go north. As they're coming up on the turn, Josh looks to his left and sees the park ranger truck coming up Highway Z right toward them. He starts honking and flashing his lights. As the Jeep and the truck are nearing their own collision, Josh slams on the brakes. The beast jumps off the back of the Jeep. Josh floors it again, passing the park ranger's truck, then gets onto Highway Z and just starts driving. After about 10 minutes, with no sign of the creature, he turns around to go south. He doesn't want to pass that spot in the road again, but they have to go that way if they're going to get home. As they get back to the spot where they lost the beast, they see the park ranger's truck sitting there. So they stop. And Josh is thinking, maybe they got the bear. Because in his head, it still had to have been a rabid bear, because what else could it be? He rolls down the window, and as one of the rangers walks over to the truck and he says, "Hey, you guys should just keep going. We just put down this animal and the boss is coming, so we might as well just keep you guys out of all of the red tape." Well, Josh is smart enough not to look a gift horse in the mouth, says thank you, and takes off. About 3 or 4 miles down the road, they pass 3 more park ranger trucks and a state trooper pulling up the rear. The state trooper does a U-ey and pulls the boys over. The trooper asks the boys if they were in the area. And Josh comes clean with everything that happened. The trooper gets everybody's name and contact information, tells them not to worry, it was just a dog, and tells them they can go. The boys spend the next few days speculating on what that thing could have been, with Josh's little brother firmly in the werewolf camp, saying it was walking on its hind legs like a human. Another week goes by, and Josh gets a call from his scout leader. He says, "I heard you did some good work at the cemetery, and that there is some kind of ruckus. Why don't you come on over and we'll get everything straightened out so you can get your Eagle Scout badge." When Josh gets to the Scoutmaster's house, parked right in front is a park ranger truck and a big black Suburban that he knows does not belong to the Scoutmaster. He knocks on the door and the Scoutmaster answers, leading him through the house right into the kitchen. In the kitchen, Josh is greeted by a park ranger, a female in a pantsuit, and 2 other men in suits, one with glasses and the other, much bigger one, that looks very uncomfortable in a suit. The Scoutmaster sits next to the ranger as the female sits on the ranger's other side. The two men in suits sit on either side of Josh. Park ranger asks Josh if all the boys are okay and if there's any damage to the Jeep or debris from the animal. Josh is thinking, oh my God, I must be in trouble. Are they here to arrest me? But I didn't do anything. Sensing his distress, the smaller man in glasses tells him, I was an Eagle Scout too. And the bigger dude says, don't worry, kid, you'll get your Eagle Scout. And Josh is thinking, well, how is that possible? I haven't finished the job yet. The big dude says, we just need you to do one more thing, and the badge is yours. You can't tell anyone about what you saw that day. Tell everyone you saw a bear and freaked out. You didn't see it walk on two legs. You didn't see it stand on two legs. And you have no idea what happened to it after you left the cemetery. And if you don't, you won't need your Eagle Scout badge because we will take you and your friends away. Josh, stunned and scared out of his mind, agrees and carries the burden of the truth with him for years. But once he's an adult, he realizes the truth really can set you free.
And because you guys made it to the very end, let's give these awesome storytellers a round of applause. Comment below the big four, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. Also, if you enjoyed any one of these awesome creators, please go and follow their YouTube channels. I've linked it in the description and the comment section below. And more importantly, if you like content like this that dives into strange, supernatural, and mysterious cases, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.